If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 1, The King's Cross Station. September 1, 1994 dawned with the crisp promise of autumn, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of rain-washed concrete and diesel fumes through London's busy streets. King's Cross Station hummed with its usual chaotic symphony, the rhythmic clacking of departure boards, tinny announcements echoing through the vaulted ceiling, businessmen in pressed suits brushing past backpack-laden tourists. Normal people living normal lives. Arthur Hayes moved through the sea of humanity with practiced indifference. At 17, he cut an imposing figure despite his youth, tall and lean with raven black hair that fell just short of his collar and piercing blue eyes that seemed to calculate everything they observed. His attire spoke of quiet wealth, dark tailored jeans, a charcoal button-down, and a sleek blazer that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed for attention, but quality that whispered of old money. Unlike the others around him, Arthur wasn't here for business or pleasure. He was here to board a special train, a train that would take him to his school for the final time. Soon he was standing before an unremarkable wall between platforms 9 and 10. To the mundane observer, it was just another part of the station's architecture. But Arthur knew better. This ordinary wall was the gateway to platform 9 3/4, the hidden platform where the Hogwarts Express awaited to carry students to the most prestigious school of witchcraft and wizardry in Britain. Arthur was a student at Hogwarts, boarding for his 7th and final year. But unlike the excited first years or nostalgic seniors, his expression betrayed nothing. This was merely a journey he'd endured 6 times before. One more wouldn't change a thing. As he approached the barrier separating the mundane from the magical, a familiar face emerged from the crowd. A woman in her late 30s with auburn hair cut in a practical bob, wearing a well-tailored suit that could easily conceal multiple weapons. Arthur suppressed a sigh. He would recognize that face anywhere. Aurora Thatcher, his unofficial guardian and an agent working for the MI6 Wizarding Affairs Division. It was a complicated arrangement, one he had never asked for but couldn't entirely escape. "Arthur," she greeted him, her voice a pleasant alto, though laced with a professional coolness that never quite vanished. A small, almost polite smile touched her lips. "Off for your final year, I presume?" "Obviously," Arthur replied, his tone clipped, devoid of any warmth. He wasn't rude, not overtly, but he saw no need to feign pleasantries. He had known Aurora for years, in the way a monitored subject knows their handler. "What are you doing here?" She smiled, though there was a hint of something sharper in her eyes. "Can't I just come to see you off? It's your final year, after all." "How sentimental," Arthur replied dryly. "I didn't think that was in your job description." "It's not." She glanced at her watch, an expensive timepiece that doubled as a magical detector. "But I've always exceeded expectations, haven't I?" Arthur studied her face, noting the slight shadows beneath her eyes, the tightness around her mouth. "What does MI6 want now?" Aurora's smile faded, replaced by a more businesslike expression. "Always straight to the point." "Fine. Have you reconsidered our offer?" Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. "There's nothing to consider. I told you before I'm not interested in working for anyone, especially not a government agency." "You have unique talents, Arthur," Aurora pressed. "Talents that could benefit." "Not interested," Arthur interrupted. "If you want my help, I've already given your boss the option." Aurora hesitated. "My director isn't comfortable with the arrangement you proposed. Hiring someone your age as an independent consultant isn't standard procedure." "Then we have nothing further to discuss," Arthur stated flatly. "If they want my expertise, they'll meet my terms." A tense silence stretched between them before Aurora sighed. "You know, most teenagers would jump at the opportunity we're offering." "I'm not most teenagers," Arthur replied. "Was there anything else, or may I proceed to my train?" Aurora shifted her weight, studying him. "Never understood why you wizards take an ordinary train to school. It should be easier to just travel the way you usually do. Teleport from one place to another." "Wizards have weird minds and peculiar tastes," Arthur said with the faintest hint of disdain. "I'm happy this will be my final year here." Aurora sighed, the professional mask slipping just slightly. "So it's still America after graduation? You're really leaving Britain behind?" "This country has nothing for me," Arthur replied, something dark flickering across his features. "The opportunities I need are elsewhere." "Opportunities?" Aurora repeated, watching him carefully. "Or is it that this place holds too many memories?" Arthur's expression hardened. Both. Is that all? Safe journey, Arthur, she said, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. A letter now and then wouldn't kill you. Arthur offered a curt nod, neither a promise nor a refusal. Goodbye, Aurora. See you when I see you. Without waiting for her response, he walked purposefully toward the barrier, the familiar magical shimmer becoming visible only to his trained eye as he approached. He stepped through, leaving the mundane world and Aurora Thatcher behind. Platform 9 3/4 exploded into view, a vibrant tableau of steam, scarlet, and boisterous farewells. The Hogwarts Express, a gleaming engine of crimson and brass, dominated the platform, hissing impatiently as plumes of white steam momentarily obscured the throng of students and families. As Arthur walked along the platform toward the train, he could feel the subtle shift in atmosphere, the almost palpable hum of magic in the air. He was back in the wizarding world, a realm he both understood intimately and utterly rejected. Parents fussed over children, loading trunks and cages containing owls, cats, and toads. First years huddled in nervous excitement, older students greeted friends with enthusiastic embraces, prefects strutted importantly with their badges gleaming. Arthur moved through the sea of humanity with purpose, his presence drawing whispers and sidelong glances. He was used to it by now, the rumors, the judgment, the way people seemed to shrink away from him. It didn't bother him. Not anymore. He boarded the train and found an empty compartment near the rear. Sliding the door shut behind him, he settled into the seat by the window, his gaze fixed on the platform outside. The compartment was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos beyond its confines. Arthur leaned his head against the glass, watching as families said their final goodbyes. He didn't need to look to know that no one would join him. His reputation ensured that. Just as the train's whistle blew, signaling its imminent departure, the compartment door slid open. Arthur glanced up to see three familiar faces, Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger. The golden trio of Gryffindor. For a moment, there was silence as they took in the sight of him. Weasley reacted first, his freckled face screwing up in recognition. "Let's find another compartment," he muttered, already backing away. Potter hesitated, looking between Arthur and his friend. "Why? What's wrong?" "Trust me," Weasley insisted, tugging at Potter's sleeve. "I'll explain later." The boy who lived gave Arthur one last curious glance before allowing himself to be pulled away. But the girl Granger lingered a moment longer, her sharp eyes falling to the notebook in Arthur's hands where complex formulas and diagrams were sketched with meticulous precision. "Those aren't school books," she observed, academic curiosity momentarily overriding caution. "No," Arthur confirmed, offering nothing more. She seemed about to ask something else when Weasley called from the corridor. "Hermione, come on." With a last curious look, she followed her friends, sliding the compartment door closed. Arthur returned his attention to the window, a faint, mirthless smile playing at his lips. Even the famous Harry Potter, savior of the wizarding world, wasn't immune to house prejudices. So predictable. So limited in their understanding of the world beyond their narrow experiences. Arthur turned his gaze to the window as the urban landscape of London began to dissolve into the green and gold of the English countryside. The train lurched forward, gathering speed as it carried its passengers away from the mundane world and toward the ancient castle that housed Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Logos and colors. That was all it took, wasn't it? To define, to categorize, to judge. Green and silver. A snake emblem. Slytherin. Muggleborn. The labels clung to him like shadows, shaping perceptions, dictating interactions. He glanced down at his robes, the deep green fabric, the silver trim, the coiled snake embroidered on his chest. Just cloth, just colors, just a symbol. But in this world, they were everything. A brand. A barrier. A destiny, he was determined to transcend. His final year. His last journey on this train. It was an ending, yes, but also a beginning. Beyond Hogwarts, beyond the wizarding world, lay a far larger stage, a world of gods and monsters, of technology and innovation. Chapter 2, Second Chances. As the Hogwarts Express rumbled northward through the English countryside, Arthur Hayes sat alone in his compartment, the familiar landscape blurring past the window. The brief encounter with Potter and his friends had stirred memories he usually kept carefully compartmentalized. With a quiet sigh, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver pocket watch. The timepiece wasn't particularly expensive or magical, just a simple Muggle antique that most wizards would dismiss as worthless. But to Arthur, it was priceless. He clicked it open, revealing not a clock face but a photograph, a smiling couple with a young boy between them, all three beaming at the camera in front of an elegant London home. Arthur's thumb brushed over their faces, his expression momentarily softening before the mask of indifference settled back into place. Such moments of vulnerability were reserved for solitude, a luxury rarely afforded in the wizarding world where portraits could gossip and ghosts drifted through walls without warning. Arthur Hayes had not always been Arthur Hayes. Before this life, he had existed in another world entirely, a world where Harry Potter was nothing more than fictional stories created for entertainment. The memories of that previous existence had faded with time, becoming fragmented and dreamlike, but they remained, shaping him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. His rebirth had been abrupt and disorienting, darkness, a floating sensation, and then sudden, terrifying awareness inside the body of a newborn infant. Unable to move with any coordination or communicate, trapped in a helpless form while possessing the consciousness of an adult. His first memory in this new existence was the harsh light of a hospital room, unfamiliar voices speaking in British accents, and a woman's exhausted but joyful face looming above him. "He's perfect," the woman had whispered, eyes brimming with tears. "Look at those eyes, Richard. So alert already." "Takes after his mother," a man had replied fondly. "Brilliant from day one." Sarah and Richard Hayes. His new parents. The photograph in his pocket watch captured them as they had been alive, vibrant, proud. Unaware that their newborn son was anything but ordinary. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Arthur began to piece together fragments of his new reality. He was in London, in the late 20th century. His parents were ordinary people, a middle-class couple who had no idea that their newborn son was anything but ordinary. They named him Arthur, a name that felt both familiar and foreign to him. He couldn't remember his old name, but he knew it wasn't Arthur. The Hayes family lived in a comfortable townhouse in Kensington, London. Richard ran a successful accounting firm with several prominent clients, while Sarah lectured in economics at Imperial College. They were educated, cultured, financially secure and utterly clueless about the unique nature of their child's consciousness. From his earliest days in this new life, Arthur had been careful to develop at a seemingly natural but accelerated pace. He spoke his first words at 6 months, read by age 3, and demonstrated a prodigious memory that his proud parents attributed to good genes and early education. But Arthur knew better. He was playing a long game, and he wasn't going to waste this second chance. Given his rebirth in London, Arthur had initially assumed he was in the Harry Potter universe. The possibility excited and terrified him in equal measure. If Hogwarts existed, if magic was real, then so too would be the dangers of that world: dark lords, magical wars, blood prejudice. He needed to prepare. But his attempts at performing accidental magic yielded nothing. He even stayed awake on Halloween night in 1981, when he was 4 years old, to watch for any signs of celebration the night Voldemort was supposedly vanquished by the Potters. There were no fireworks, no cloaked figures dancing in the streets. If this world contained Hogwarts and magic, it was as hidden from Muggles as it was supposed to be. Still, the possibility lingered in his mind. In the meantime, he focused on what he could control: growing up healthy, exercising regularly, and accelerating through the early years of childhood as efficiently as possible. Years passed, and Arthur turned 6. He had already begun to make a name for himself in the neighborhood. His parents marveled at his intelligence, at the way he devoured books and solved problems that were far beyond his years. They enrolled him in the best schools, encouraged his curiosity, and did everything they could to nurture his talents. It was at this age that his carefully constructed understanding of his new reality first began to crack. The morning remained vivid in his memory. Sitting at the breakfast table, his mother reading the newspaper while his father prepared toast. Arthur had been idly watching the television in the corner, BBC News reporting on international events, when the screen changed to show a press conference. And now we go live to New York, where Howard Stark, founder of Stark Industries, is about to address concerns over the company's new defense contract with the Pentagon. Arthur froze, orange juice halfway to his mouth. Howard Stark. Not a fictional character, but a real person, making headlines on the morning news. "Mother," he asked carefully, setting down his glass, "who is Howard Stark?" Sarah Hayes glanced up from her paper. "One of those American industrialists, darling. Built his fortune during the war, I believe. Weapons manufacturer primarily. Why do you ask?" Just curious, Arthur replied, his mind racing as he watched the unmistakable figure of Howard Stark, older than his movie depictions but recognizable nonetheless, approach a podium. That single moment shattered all his assumptions. He was not in the Harry Potter world. He had been reborn into the much more dangerous Marvel Universe, where heroes, villains, and gods were commonplace. This revelation made Arthur rethink all his plans for the future. In the Marvel world, being an ordinary human meant vulnerability unless you carved out your own path to power. He had already checked his ancestry on both sides and knew for sure he wasn't descended from any aliens or likely to inherit superpowers. His path to significance was clear: technology or enhancement. And for both, what he needed was knowledge and money. After that revelation, Arthur redirected his focus with laser precision. Academics became his first battleground. He threw himself into his studies with a fervor that startled his teachers and delighted his parents. Grade skipping became the norm as he flew through primary school, his age a constant mismatch with his academic level. His parents, initially hesitant about his accelerated education, were soon convinced by his unwavering logic and the undeniable proof of his advanced intellect. Alongside academic pursuits, physical prowess became essential. The Marvel world was not a place where brains alone guaranteed survival. He convinced his parents to enroll him in a well-regarded London dojo that taught a pragmatic blend of martial arts. He wanted practical skills, not just forms and katas. The dojo became his second classroom, where he trained with a focus and intensity that impressed his instructors and intimidated fellow students. Then came the financial aspect. Building a tech empire required capital. He began dropping carefully crafted insights during dinner conversations with his father, casual remarks about emerging technologies, undervalued stocks, and market trends. These hunches, as he called them, yielded substantial returns, transforming his father's small accounting firm into Hayes Investment Strategies, a boutique investment firm catering to wealthy clients. Everything had been proceeding perfectly according to plan. With the Wall Street crash of 1987 successfully navigated thanks to Arthur's subtle warnings, the Hayes family fortune had grown substantially. Another few years, and Arthur would have been positioned to enter university early, perhaps intern at Stark Industries or another tech giant, and begin building the foundations for his true ambitions. Then came the night that changed everything, the night Arthur discovered that this world held more dangers than he had anticipated, and that his carefully constructed plans weren't the only ones in motion. The pocket watch snapped shut, pulling Arthur back to the present. Outside, fields gave way to dense, rugged forests as the train pushed northward. Memories of his parents always left a hollow ache, like an old injury flaring in bad weather. He tucked the watch carefully back into his pocket and returned to his notebook, forcing himself to focus on equations and diagrams that could bridge magic and technology. The past was fixed, immutable. Only the future mattered now, and Arthur Hayes intended to shape it exactly as he wished, no matter what obstacles stood in his path. Chapter 3, Shattered. January 1988 arrived with a bitter cold that gripped London in its icy embrace. The Hayes family, however, remained warm and content behind the solid walls of their manor on the outskirts of the city. The evening had begun with a deceptive normalcy, a gentle rhythm of domesticity that had become their comfortable routine over the years. Dinner had been a quiet affair, filled with the gentle clinking of cutlery and the murmur of polite conversation. Arthur's mother, Sarah, chatted animatedly about her day and the amusing antics of her students at Imperial College. His father, Richard, discussed the fluctuating stock market, casually mentioning a particularly shrewd investment Arthur had suggested that was about to pay off handsomely. The tech sector jumped exactly as you predicted, Richard said, shooting his son a look that mixed pride with puzzlement. I still don't know how you do it, Arthur. Some of our clients are calling you a little oracle. Arthur shrugged, feigning modesty while carefully steering the conversation away from his uncanny financial insights. Just reading patterns, father. Anyone could do it if they paid attention. Sarah laughed, reaching over to ruffle his hair, a gesture he tolerated only from her. Not everyone has your brain, sweetheart. You're special. If only they knew how special, Arthur thought, but kept the observation to himself. After dinner, they moved to the conservatory, a glass-paneled room bathed in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. Tea was served Earl Grey for his parents, a herbal infusion for Arthur accompanied by delicate pastries his mother had picked up from a patisserie in the city. They sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the gentle rustle of leaves in the manicured garden outside and the distant chirping of early evening birds. Arthur, despite his habitually detached demeanor, felt a flicker of warmth in his chest, a quiet appreciation for this moment of tranquility. His parents, for all their mundane concerns and lack of understanding of his true nature, were good people. They loved him unconditionally, supported his unusual intellect without question, and provided him with a comfortable, stable life. In the lottery of rebirth, he couldn't have asked for better guardians. Then, the world shattered. It started with a sound that ripped through the peaceful evening like fabric tearing sharp and abrupt. Glass breaking. Not the gentle tinkling of a dropped teacup, but the violent, explosive sound of a windowpane being brutally smashed inward. Before they could react, before they could even fully register the sound, the conservatory doors burst open with a splintering crash. Wood and glass flew inward like deadly shrapnel. 5 men stormed through the opening, their movements precise and coordinated. They wore black tactical gear, faces obscured by balaclavas, each carrying modified submachine guns, military-grade weapons not typically available to common criminals. Professional hit squad, Arthur's mind supplied clinically, even as adrenaline flooded his system. This was no random home invasion. Richard Hayes, the lead intruder, demanded, his accent American with a faint southern drawl. Arthur's father rose slowly from his chair, instinctively positioning himself between the armed men and his family. "I'm Hayes," he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the situation. "Whatever you want, my wife and son have nothing to do with this." The leader tilted his head slightly. "That's where you're wrong." Then the night erupted in gunfire and screams. Richard Hayes lunged toward his wife and son, attempting to shield them with his body. He managed 2 steps before the bullets struck him. 3 impacts to the chest. 1 to the neck. He crumpled to the floor, his expression one of confused disbelief rather than pain, blood spreading across his white shirt in a rapidly expanding crimson stain. "Richard!" Sarah screamed, launching herself from her chair toward her fallen husband. Arthur tried to move, to grab his mother, to pull her down behind the heavy stone table, but his reactions were too slow. The second gunman pivoted smoothly and fired a short burst. Sarah Hayes jerked violently as the bullets tore through her, then collapsed across her husband's body, her outstretched hand still reaching toward her son. Something struck Arthur hard from behind, a glancing blow from a bullet, or perhaps a piece of the shattered table. He went down, hitting the stone terrace with enough force to momentarily stun him. A sharp pain lanced through his temple as his head connected with the flagstones. Warm blood trickled down his face, blurring his vision. "Check the kid," the leader ordered, approaching the bodies of Arthur's parents. "Make it clean." Arthur lay still, the world spinning around him. He could see his parents' bodies just meters away, his father's eyes staring sightlessly at the darkening sky, his mother's hand still reaching toward him. "They're dead. My parents are dead." The thought entered his mind with strange clarity. Not his first parents, from before his rebirth. These parents. The ones who had raised him for 10 years. Who had loved him, supported him, nurtured his ambitions. Who had been unwitting pawns in his grand strategies, yet had somehow become genuinely important to him despite his determination to maintain emotional distance. Dead, because of something he didn't understand. A shadow fell across him as one of the gunmen approached, weapon trained on Arthur's prone form. Through the haze of pain and shock, Arthur could see the man's cold eyes through the opening in his balaclava. The gunman raised his weapon, adjusting his aim for a headshot. "Nothing personal, kid," he said flatly. Something broke inside Arthur Hayes. Not his body, though the pain was intense. Not his mind, which remained analytically aware even in extremis. Something deeper. A barrier. A dam. A wall between himself and an energy he had sought but never found. Until now. It began as a pressure behind his eyes, a building force that seemed to originate from his very core. The air around him grew heavy, charged with potential like the moment before lightning strikes. The flagstones beneath him began to vibrate. The wine glasses on the shattered table sang a high, crystalline note that cut through the ringing in his ears. The gunman hesitated, his eyes widening as he registered that something was very wrong. "What the?" he began. Arthur screamed. Not in fear or pain, but in rage. Pure, incandescent rage that transcended his carefully constructed self-control. The sound seemed to come from somewhere beyond his physical form, infused with power that should not have been possible. The pressure inside him released all at once, erupting outward in a wave of raw, uncontrolled force. The air shimmered, then vibrated, then seemed to thicken, becoming heavy and oppressive. Objects in the conservatory began to tremble, then rattle, then lift off the ground. Teacups, pastries, magazines, even the heavy wicker furniture, all of it levitating, swirling in a chaotic vortex around Arthur like debris caught in a tornado. The gunman closest to Arthur took the brunt of the assault. A serving fork pierced his throat with impossible velocity. Dozens of glass shards embedded themselves in his face and chest like crystalline buckshot. He dropped without firing a shot, blood spraying from severed arteries. The others reacted with professional speed, turning their weapons toward this new, impossible threat. But they were too slow. The leader caught a heavy crystal decanter in the center of his forehead with enough force to shatter his frontal bone. Two others were lifted off their feet and slammed against the stone wall of the house with bone-shattering impact, impaled by a hail of improvised projectiles, butter knives, broken chair legs, garden tools. The fifth man managed to fire a short burst before a silver letter opener, a graduation gift to Sarah Hayes from her parents, drove through his right eye and into his brain. His bullets went wide, shattering a decorative planter instead of hitting their target. In less than 10 seconds, 5 trained killers lay dead or dying on the Hayes family conservatory floor. The unnatural wind died as suddenly as it had arisen. Objects that had been caught in the telekinetic maelstrom clattered to the ground. An eerie silence followed, broken only by Arthur's ragged breathing and the gurgling last breaths of one of the attackers. Arthur remained on the ground, trembling uncontrollably, blood running freely from his nose and ears. The pressure in his head had subsided, but in its place was a bone-deep exhaustion unlike anything he had ever experienced. Every muscle ached as though he had run a marathon. His vision swam, darkness encroaching at the edges. With tremendous effort, he dragged himself toward his parents' bodies. Some irrational part of him still hoped they might be alive, might respond to his touch. But as he reached them, reality reasserted itself. Richard Hayes stared at nothing, his expression forever frozen in that last moment of confused alarm. Sarah's body was draped protectively over her husband, her back torn open by the bullets that had killed her. "Mother," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "Father." He reached out a shaking hand to touch their cooling skin, and something unexpected happened. Arthur Hayes, who had prided himself on his emotional control, who had always maintained a degree of detachment from these people he considered temporary guardians, began to cry. Not the calculated tears of a child manipulating adults. Not the performance of grief he had prepared for various contingencies. Real tears, wrenched from some place inside him he hadn't known existed. Heavy sobs that shook his slender frame as he collapsed between the bodies of the two people who had loved him unconditionally. In that moment, all his plans, all his calculations, all his careful preparations seemed meaningless. He was simply a child who had lost his parents to violence he didn't fully understand. How long he remained there, he couldn't say. Minutes, perhaps. The gathering darkness of evening deepened to true night. Blood, his own and that of the attackers, cooled on the flagstones. His tears eventually subsided, replaced by a hollow numbness that seemed to spread from his chest outward. Then came a series of sharp cracking sounds from various points around the property, sounds Arthur had never heard in reality but instantly recognized from descriptions in books he'd read in his previous life. The crack of someone operating. Chapter 4, Aftermath and the Magical Unveiling. The sharp pops of apparition echoed through the ruined manor, growing louder and closer with each crackle of displaced air. Arthur, still trembling on the conservatory floor, turned his head weakly toward the sound. Figures materialized just outside the shattered doors, their long, dark cloaks absorbing the dim light like shadows given form. Wands were drawn, held at the ready, their tips glowing with a faint, ethereal luminescence. The newcomers moved with a practiced, silent efficiency, fanning out, their eyes scanning the devastation, taking in the scene in rapid, professional sweeps. Despite the surreal nature of their attire in the modern setting of his home, they radiated an undeniable aura of authority, of competence, of magic. One of them, a woman with a stern, no-nonsense air about her, detached herself from the group and approached Arthur. Even in the dimly lit conservatory, he could see the sharp lines of her face, the unwavering directness of her gaze. She reminded him, eerily, of a character description he vaguely recalled from books he'd read in his previous life, Amelia Bones, the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. This woman possessed the same aura of calm, unflappable authority. By now Arthur, even in his dazed state, understood what had happened. He had unleashed accidental magic on his attackers. A bitter realization twisted in his gut: if only this latent power had manifested moments earlier, his parents might still be alive. But there was something else too. If magical law enforcement existed here, alongside the technology and figures of the Marvel Universe he'd already confirmed, this wasn't just the Marvel world. This was a crossover universe where both existed simultaneously. The female auror lowered her wand slightly as she neared, her sharp, intelligent eyes assessing him with a thoroughness that was both clinical and oddly compassionate, the kind of compassion one might expect from a seasoned investigator handling a traumatized witness rather than the warmth of a comforting adult. "It's all right, son," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I'm Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. We're here to help you." Arthur blinked and managed a small, shaky nod. My parents," he stammered, his voice hoarse and thin. He trailed off, gesturing weakly towards the lifeless forms on the floor. Amelia's gaze followed his gesture, her expression hardening almost imperceptibly. She took in the scene: the bodies of his parents, the mangled corpses of the intruders, the wrecked conservatory, the clear signs of something beyond mundane violence. "We detected a significant magical signature in this location," she stated, her voice neutral, devoid of accusation, but undeniably pointed. "Did you do this?" She gestured toward the bodies of the attackers, her expression carefully controlled. Arthur nodded slowly. "I don't know how," he whispered, allowing genuine confusion to enter his voice. "I was scared. Angry. It just happened." "Accidental magic," said another auror, a younger man with a scarred face. "But Merlin's beard, I've never seen accidental magic do this. Power on this scale in a child his age." A third auror murmured, her wand moving in complex patterns as she performed what Arthur assumed were diagnostic spells. "Extraordinarily rare." "The boy's in shock, Williamson," Bones said sharply. "Magical assessment can wait." She turned back to Arthur. "What's your name, child?" "Arthur Hayes," he replied, allowing his voice to quaver. "Arthur," Bones said gently, "I need to know what happened here. Can you tell me?" Arthur began to recount the events, seeing no reason to lie when he was clearly the victim. He described the peaceful evening, the sudden intrusion, the masked figures, the gunfire, his parents falling. As he spoke, the memories flooded back with painful clarity, and to his surprise, his eyes welled up again and his voice became hoarse with genuine emotion. Amelia listened intently, her gaze unwavering, her expression inscrutable. When he finished his disjointed account, she nodded slowly, thoughtfully. Then, she gestured to another auror, who stepped forward and began to cast more elaborate spells, their wands weaving intricate patterns in the air, illuminating shimmering trails of residual energy. "Definite accidental magic," the auror confirmed after a moment. "Extremely powerful, but uncontrolled." "Am I in trouble?" Arthur asked, voice small, innocent. Amelia's expression softened slightly. "You did nothing wrong, Arthur. What happened was accidental magic, a natural defensive response when a young wizard is in danger. You couldn't control it, and you're not responsible for the outcome." She paused, watching his face intently, gauging his reaction. Are you aware of magic, son? Of the wizarding world?" He shook his head slowly, feigning the bewilderment expected of someone whose worldview was being upended. "Magic?" he whispered, his voice laced with a carefully crafted blend of fear and curiosity. "Like what is performed by stage magicians?" "No," Amelia replied with gentle firmness. "Not illusions or tricks." She drew her wand, pointing it at a shattered side table nearby. "Reparo." Before Arthur's eyes, the splintered wood gathered itself, fragments flying through the air, rejoining seamlessly, the entire table reconstructing itself as if the damage had never occurred. Even the bullet holes vanished, the polished surface becoming smooth and unblemished once more. Arthur stared, letting his genuine amazement at seeing real magic for the first time show on his face. "You are a wizard, son," Amelia said softly. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Just then, another sound, distinct from the magical pops of apparition, echoed through the ruined manor. The discreet hum of approaching vehicles. Cars stopping outside. Doors opening, closing. Footsteps approaching with measured precision. The non-magical authorities had arrived. 4 plainly dressed figures entered the conservatory, their demeanor subtly different from the robed aurors. No wands, no robes, but an air of quiet competence, a shared, unspoken understanding with the magical authorities already present. They were muggles, but not ordinary ones. These were liaisons, agents operating in the shadows, aware of the magic that existed just beyond the veil of everyday reality. The leader, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, approached Amelia Bones directly. Madam Bones, she greeted with a curt nod. MI6, Supernatural Division. I'm Agent Harlow. We received the alert. Agent Harlow, Amelia returned the nod. 5 deceased muggles, professional mercenaries by the look of them. 2 civilian casualties, and 1 magical minor. She gestured toward Arthur. The boy's parents? Harlow asked, her gaze briefly shifting to Arthur before returning to Bones. Yes, Amelia confirmed. It appears to be a targeted attack. Mundane methods firearms. The attackers were killed by a surge of accidental magic from the child. Harlow nodded, seemingly unsurprised by this information. We'll handle the non-magical authorities. Official report will cite a home invasion gone wrong. Self-defense with improvised weapons. She turned toward Arthur, her expression softening marginally. I'm sorry for your loss, young man. Arthur nodded numbly, his mind racing beneath the facade of shock. The 2 groups, Aurors and MI6 agents, moved with practiced coordination around him, a silent ballet of interagency cooperation. Whispered conversations ensued, logistical arrangements being made. Cover stories for the local police, protocols for handling the bodies, procedures for managing the crime scene. Arthur watched everything with exhausted detachment, his confusion slowly giving way to a chilling clarity. This world was far more complicated than he had imagined. The non-magical authorities were more aware of their magical counterparts than books had ever suggested. The Marvel Universe's technological advancements had apparently forced the wizarding world into a delicate cooperation with Muggle governments to maintain their secrecy. As the adults continued their work, Arthur huddled in a shock blanket someone had draped over his shoulders, his eyes never leaving his parents' bodies. This world was far more dangerous than he had anticipated, a place where both magic and high-tech threats could destroy everything you loved in an instant. And in that moment, as the reality of his situation truly sank in, Arthur made a silent vow. He would master both worlds' magic and technology. He would gain power enough to ensure that no one could ever hurt him again. And one day, when he was strong enough, he would find out who had sent these men and why. One day, they would pay. Chapter 5, New Beginnings. The funeral was a blur of muted colors and hushed voices. Rain fell in a gentle mist, beating on the black umbrellas of the few mourners who had gathered to pay their respects. Arthur stood between the twin mahogany caskets, his face a carefully composed mask of grief, while inside he felt a curious hollowness. Not an absence of emotion, the pain was real enough, but a disconnection, as if part of him was observing the proceedings from a clinical distance. There weren't many attendees. His parents had been only children of their respective families, and his grandparents had passed away years earlier. A handful of his father's business associates were present, along with several of his mother's colleagues from Imperial College. Their faces were solemn, their condolences sincere but awkward. What does one say to a child who has watched his parents murdered? Such a tragedy. If there's anything we can do. You're being so brave. Empty platitudes that filled the air and faded just as quickly. Arthur went through the motions, accepting handshakes and whispered condolences with quiet dignity, but feeling utterly disconnected from it all. His parents were gone. Buried. Reduced to memories and photographs. The finality of it settled upon him like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. In the days following the funeral, amidst the logistical whirlwind of cleaning up the manor and settling his parents' affairs, the matter of Arthur's guardianship arose. He was, after all, a minor in both the Muggle and magical worlds, a fact that created a bureaucratic nightmare for the authorities involved. There were not many options in the magical world since Arthur was a Muggle-born and had no relatives in the magical world who could take care of him, which was the standard procedure followed there. There were no orphanages in the magical world. Thus, it fell to the non-magical authorities to handle his guardianship. He was only 10 years old, and with no living relatives, the logical solution would have been placement in an orphanage. But Arthur refused. I don't need a family, Arthur stated firmly. I can take care of myself. The adults exchanged skeptical glances. You're 10 years old, Agent Harlow pointed out, her tone suggesting she was dealing with a particularly stubborn child rather than someone with legitimate concerns. Almost 11, Arthur corrected. And I'll be attending Hogwarts in a few months, spending most of the year there anyway. In the meantime, I have my house. I have money. I have all I need. It's not about material provisions, Bones countered. Children need supervision, guidance. My parents are dead, Arthur interrupted, allowing a calculated edge of anger into his voice. No one can replace them. No one can provide what they gave me. What I need now is stability, not to be shipped off to strangers or an institution. He leaned forward, meeting their gazes directly. I won't accept placement in an orphanage. I'll run if you try to force me. The threat hung in the air, its implications clear. A magical child with Arthur's demonstrated power, desperate and on the run, could create significant problems for both magical and non-magical authorities. Several meetings followed over the next 2 weeks, with various officials debating his fate as though he weren't even present. Eventually, a compromise emerged, one Arthur suspected was as much a matter of bureaucratic convenience as it was of his welfare. He would be allowed to live in the smaller London townhouse owned by his family, rather than the manor where his parents had died. However, he would be assigned a liaison from MI6's Supernatural Division to check on him regularly and report on his adjustment. Should he prove unable to manage independently, the arrangement would be terminated, and more traditional guardianship imposed. That liaison turned out to be Aurora Thatcher, a junior agent in her late 20s with sharp eyes and an air of no-nonsense efficiency. Their first meeting took place in the townhouse Arthur had already begun setting up as his new home. "Let's be clear about expectations," she said after the introductions, refusing the tea he'd offered in a deliberate show of domestic capability. "I'm not your nanny, your housekeeper, or your friend. I'm here to ensure you're safe, healthy, and not causing problems for either world." "Understood," Arthur replied, appreciating her directness even as he noted the wariness in her posture. She was treating him like a potentially unstable element which, considering the circumstances of their connection, was probably justified. "I'll be checking in 3 times a week initially," she continued. "Random visits, at my discretion. I'll need to see that you're maintaining appropriate living conditions, attending to your education, and generally behaving like a responsible human being instead of a feral child." "Will you be testing me on my times tables as well?" Arthur asked dryly. A flicker of amusement crossed her face before she suppressed it. "Don't be smart. This arrangement is unprecedented and, frankly, precarious. One misstep, and you'll find yourself in a group home faster than you can say emancipation." Thus began Arthur's new life as an independent 10-year-old. The first order of business was to consolidate his resources. With Aurora's reluctant assistance, he arranged for the sale of most of his parents' properties, retaining only the manor, which he couldn't bring himself to part with despite the painful memories, and the London townhouse where he now resided. The sale of the properties was complicated by inheritance taxes, which consumed a significant portion of the proceeds. Arthur was furious about this but powerless to prevent it. His father had not established the kind of trusts or legal structures that might have sheltered the assets from such claims. "Financial planning apparently doesn't account for assassination," he muttered bitterly as they left the solicitor's office after signing yet another set of documents. Aurora, walking beside him, gave him a sharp look. "That's not a word you should throw around lightly." "Why not? It's what happened." Arthur stopped on the pavement, facing her directly. "Have they made any progress finding who was behind it? Those men weren't random burglars. They knew my father's name. They were professionals." Aurora's expression shifted subtly, a tightening around the eyes that confirmed his suspicions before she could compose herself. "The investigation is ongoing," she said carefully. "Which means they either have no leads or they're not sharing them with me," Arthur translated. She didn't deny it. "You're a child, Arthur. Some information isn't." "They were my parents," he cut in, his voice low and intense. "I watched them die. I have a right to know who was responsible." A flash of genuine sympathy crossed Aurora's face. "As far as we can determine, your father's impressive investment gains attracted attention from certain individuals who wanted his assistance with their own financial matters. When he declined, citing ethical concerns about their sources of income, they killed him," Arthur finished flatly. "And my mother. And tried to kill me too. That's our working theory, yes." Arthur absorbed this, his mind cataloguing the information while a cold, hard knot of resolve formed in his chest. Someday, when he had the resources and the power, he would find these people. He would make them pay. But for now, he had more immediate concerns. With the property sales complete and the inheritance taxes paid, Arthur directed a significant portion of his remaining wealth toward 2 goals. First, with Aurora's help and her contacts in the wizarding world, he facilitated the conversion of a substantial sum to gold galleons, establishing a vault at Gringotts in his name. Second, he invested the remainder in companies he knew would thrive in the coming decades: technology firms, pharmaceutical giants, and emerging industries that would shape the new millennium. These are unusually sophisticated investment choices for someone your age, Aurora remarked as she helped him finalize the paperwork. Your father's influence, I assume. Arthur nodded, allowing her to believe what she wished. He talked about the market a lot, he said simply. With his financial affairs in order, his living situation stabilized, and the immediate aftermath of the tragedy beginning to settle, Arthur turned his attention to understanding his new reality. In just a few weeks, he would receive his official Hogwarts letter, marking his entry into the wizarding world. Chapter 6, Preparing for Hogwarts. The days that followed drifted by in quiet, almost monastic solitude. The silence should have brought peace, but instead, it provided fertile ground for memories that ambushed Arthur in unguarded moments. His mother's laugh, his father's patient voice explaining market fluctuations at breakfast, those small family rituals he had never fully appreciated now lost forever. At night, his dreams replayed the same horror, blood-stained flagstones, shattered glass, and the brutal violence that ended lives he'd barely realized he truly valued. He woke often, gasping and tangled in sheets, calling out instinctively for parents who would never answer again. But daylight offered structure, and Arthur used routine as his defense against grief. Living alone presented unexpected challenges. Mundane tasks that had been seamlessly handled by his parents or household staff now fell squarely on his shoulders: cooking, cleaning, laundry, grocery shopping. Arthur tackled these challenges with the same methodical approach he applied to everything, quickly developing efficient systems for maintaining his living space. Aurora watched from the sidelines during her visits, her expression a mixture of skepticism and reluctant admiration. He suspected she was secretly hoping he would break under the pressure of domestic responsibilities, admit defeat, and agree to more conventional guardianship arrangements. It would certainly make her life easier if he were placed in an orphanage or foster home, one less unusual assignment for an already overworked agent. But Arthur would not give her that satisfaction. Besides, these were simple tasks, ones he was proficient in thanks to his past life. At one point he even toyed with the idea of hiring a house elf to save time, however he was disappointed learning that house elves were rarely on sale. They were mostly bound to ancient wizarding families, rarely freed like Dobby in the canon, and typically either dying with their families or taking refuge in magical buildings like Hogwarts or the Ministry. For a Muggle-born like him, it was simply out of reach. As the days passed, Arthur settled into routines of rigorous self-study. He immersed himself in the books he'd bought about the wizarding world and its laws, eager to understand this new reality. Grasping the legal and social frameworks of wizarding Britain was paramount if he was to navigate it effectively. Aurora would often find him surrounded by stacks of books, his eyes glossy from hours of reading. "You don't have to push yourself so hard," she said once, after finding him surrounded by books, every time she visited, and never having fun like a child. "You're just a child." "I'm not just a child," Arthur replied without looking up. "After what has happened, normal childhood isn't exactly an option anymore." Aurora had no response to that, and Arthur preferred it that way. The less she tried to connect with him, the easier it would be to maintain the emotional distance he needed to not be emotionally used by the government agencies. He did not have good opinions about government agencies, especially the secretive kinds. Besides his academic pursuits, Arthur maintained his physical training. The dojo he once attended was now too far from his new home to be practical, and arranging transportation without parental assistance was problematic. Undeterred, Arthur converted one of the spare bedrooms into a modest training area, following a self-directed regimen based on what he remembered from his martial arts classes. It wasn't ideal, there was no instructor to correct his form or spar with him, but it kept his reflexes sharp and his body conditioned. In the Marvel world, physical prowess was as crucial as intellectual or magical ability, and he wasn't willing to neglect any avenue of strength. As the weeks passed and summer approached, Arthur fell into a rhythm of study, exercise, and household management that, while solitary, served his purposes well. Aurora's visits gradually decreased from 3 times a week to twice as she became convinced of his ability to manage independently. Soon, a month later, on May 7, 1988, a very special day arrived. It was Arthur's 11th birthday, and he expected a visitor. Not that he had been told to expect one, but he knew the pattern. 11 was the age when Hogwarts reached out to potential students, especially those born to non-magical families who might not understand what was happening to their children. Aurora arrived early that morning, carrying a small, plainly wrapped package. "Happy birthday," she said, offering the gift with an awkward half-smile. Arthur accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Looks like you did your homework." "It's my job as your guardian," she replied, but there was a softness to her voice that belied the professional statement. They spent the morning in a strange, almost comfortable silence. Aurora caught up on paperwork at the kitchen table while Arthur finished a book on basic magical theory he had acquired. Around noon, just as Aurora was suggesting they might order lunch, there was a firm knock at the door. "Looks like the professor from Hogwarts is here." "Excited?" Aurora asked. "Maybe," Arthur replied, noncommittally. Aurora opened the door to reveal a stern-looking woman in her 60s, dressed in what could only be described as an oddly formal style that seemed decades out of date. Her grey hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she peered through square spectacles with an air of assessment. "Good afternoon," the woman said crisply. "I am Professor Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I am here to see Mr. Arthur Hayes. Is this the correct address?" "Yes, he is here." "Please come in," Aurora replied. Arthur's heart pounded as he realized a new phase in his life was beginning. Hogwarts was calling him. Chapter 7, The Letter. Professor McGonagall stepped into the foyer, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the modest but well-appointed home before settling on Arthur, who had risen from his place at the kitchen table. "Ah, you must be young Mr. Hayes," she said, her Scottish accent becoming more pronounced. Arthur nodded politely. "Yes, Professor." McGonagall studied him with a slight frown, clearly surprised by his calm demeanour. Most Muggle-born children were shocked or disbelieving upon first contact with a representative from Hogwarts. Arthur's composed reception was unusual. "You seem remarkably unsurprised by my presence," she observed. Arthur hesitated, then replied, "I've had some prior exposure to magic, Professor." "Is that so?" "That makes my job easier," McGonagall said, then turning towards Aurora she asked, "Are you Mrs. Hayes?" "No. Agent Aurora Thatcher, MI6. I'm Arthur's guardian." Professor McGonagall's eyebrows rose slightly, her composed demeanour momentarily disrupted by surprise. "Guardian? I was expecting to meet with the boy's parents." "Some things happened recently and there's been a change in circumstances," Aurora said carefully. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." McGonagall nodded, her sharp eyes taking in the situation with keen assessment. "Yes, that would be prudent." Aurora led McGonagall to a small study adjacent to the entryway, closing the door behind them. Arthur remained at the kitchen table, not bothering to look up from his book. He could guess what they were discussing: his parents' deaths, his unusual living arrangement, his first encounter with magic through violence. He was happy Aurora would handle the necessary explanations so that he did not have to. 10 minutes later, the women emerged from the study. McGonagall's stern face had softened slightly, though her posture remained rigid as ever. She approached Arthur, her eyes now carrying a hint of that familiar sympathy he had grown to detest. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted him, her Scottish accent becoming more pronounced. "I am Professor McGonagall. Agent Thatcher has informed me of your situation." Arthur set his book aside and stood, offering a polite nod. "It's nice to meet you, Professor." "Well," McGonagall said, reaching into her purse and extracting an envelope of thick, yellowish parchment. "I believe this belongs to you." Arthur accepted the envelope, feeling the weight of the heavy paper in his hands. His name and address were written in emerald green ink on the front. Mr. A. Hayes. The Large Bedroom. 27 Wisteria Lane. London. He broke the purple wax seal bearing the Hogwarts coat of arms: a lion, eagle, badger, and snake surrounding a large letter H, and removed the letter inside. The contents were exactly as he expected. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Headmaster, Albus Dumbledore. Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sork, CHF. Warlock, Supreme Mugwump, International Confeet of Wizards. Dear Mr. Hayes, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on September 1st. We await your owl by no later than July 31st. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. While Arthur read through his letter, McGonagall and Aurora moved to the side of the room, speaking in hushed tones about practical matters: guardianship forms, special considerations for his situation, the necessary arrangements for a Muggle-born student with no magical parent or guardian to guide him. Arthur ignored them, examining the list of required books and equipment with careful attention to detail. After several minutes of discussion, the two women seemed to reach an agreement. McGonagall approached him again. Mr. Hayes, I understand you're already somewhat familiar with the magical world. Agent Thatcher and I have worked out the formalities of your enrollment. Given your circumstances, I'm prepared to escort you to Diagon Alley today to purchase your school supplies, if that's amenable. That would be convenient, Arthur replied, setting the letter down. Will you be joining us, Aurora? Yes, Aurora interjected before McGonagall could answer. I wouldn't say no to seeing the magical world any day. Very well, McGonagall said crisply. Shall we proceed? Diagon Alley can be quite busy, and we have much to accomplish. The journey was short and efficient. Since Arthur had already been to Diagon Alley before and possessed galleons, they skipped the Gringotts' visit. While Arthur headed to Ollivander's for his wand, Aurora and McGonagall handled the other items on the list. The wandmaker's shop was exactly as Arthur had imagined, dusty, narrow, and filled with an almost tangible magical energy. Yet the process of finding his wand proved unusually prolonged. Wand after wand was placed in his hand, only to be snatched away as Ollivander shook his head in quiet dissatisfaction. Tricky customer, the old wandmaker muttered, his pale eyes gleaming with the challenge. Very tricky indeed. Perhaps, yes, let me try something unusual. He disappeared into the depths of the shop, returning with a slender, dust-covered box. Inside lay a wand of pale wood, its surface subtly patterned with shifting whorls in the dim light. Elder wood, 13 inches, with a core of thestral tail hair, Ollivander explained, holding the wand with unusual reverence. A rare combination. Elder is notoriously difficult to master, and thestral hair, well, it has certain affinities with those who have confronted mortality. Arthur took the wand, and immediately felt a surge of warmth travel up his arm. Silver and gold sparks erupted from the tip, briefly illuminating the shadowy shop. Fascinating, Ollivander whispered, his expression a mixture of awe and unease. I've only made one other wand with these exact specifications in my lifetime. Its owner became quite remarkable. Arthur noticed the wandmaker's discomfort but chose not to press for details. He paid the 7 galleons for his wand and rejoined Aurora and McGonagall outside. Their final stop was Flourish and Blots, where Arthur selected his required textbooks along with several additional volumes on magical theory and defense. As they prepared to leave, Aurora surprised him with an unexpected gift, a handsome snowy owl with intelligent eyes. Happy birthday, she said, almost shyly. I thought you might need a way to send letters while you're at school. Especially since you promised to keep me updated. Arthur was genuinely touched by the gesture. Thank you, he said, reaching through the cage bars to stroke the owl's soft feathers. I think I'll call him Mercury. The owl hooted softly, as if in approval. As they prepared to depart, McGonagall provided Arthur with his ticket for the Hogwarts Express and detailed instructions for reaching platform 9 3/4 on September 1. She confirmed with Aurora that she would ensure Arthur reached the platform safely, then bid them farewell with a promise to see him at the start of term. Later that evening, after Aurora had left and Arthur was alone in the townhouse with his new school supplies spread across his bedroom floor, he felt a strange mixture of anticipation and caution. The wand at his side hummed with potential power, yet Aurora had warned him firmly against using it before school. The Ministry monitors underage magic, she had explained. And after what happened, they've placed special wards around your home to detect any magical activity. Best not to give them any reason to interfere with our arrangement. Arthur had agreed readily. He had no intention of drawing unnecessary attention before his magical education truly began. Instead, he planned to spend the remaining months before September studying his textbooks, preparing mentally for the challenges ahead, and continuing to manage his investments with an eye toward the future. The path before him was now clearer if more complex than he had originally anticipated. He would attend Hogwarts, master magic, and build the foundation of magical knowledge he would need. But he wouldn't lose sight of his original goals either. The Marvel Universe was still out there, with all its technological wonders and potential dangers. Somehow, he would navigate both worlds, magical and mundane, wizardry and technology. It was a daunting prospect, but as Arthur carefully arranged his new books on his desk, a surge of determination welled up within him. His parents' deaths had shown him just how vulnerable even the most carefully laid plans could be. He would not make the same mistake again. He would become powerful enough in both worlds that no one could ever threaten him again. And perhaps, when he was ready, he would finally discover who sent those men to his family's home and why. Some debts, he knew, demanded payment, no matter how long it took to collect them. Chapter 8, Hogwarts and Sorting. September 1st arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn. Arthur stood on platform 9¾ the Scarlet Hogwarts Express gleaming in the morning light as students and parents bustled around him in a chaotic dance of trunks, pets, and emotional goodbyes. "Remember our arrangement?" Aurora said, standing beside him with the professional composure that characterized all their interactions. "A letter every week detailing your progress and any concerns." Arthur nodded, his attention divided between their conversation and his careful observation of the platform's occupants. He could already identify several pure-blood families from the way they acted. He knew he had to stay away from them as they would never be his friends with his identity as a Muggle-born. The Hogwarts train journey proved pleasant enough. Arthur met many first-years mostly Muggle-borns and half-bloods and found that he got along fine with most. No one prominent from the canon was in his year, so everyone was effectively new. Arrival at Hogsmeade Station was a flurry of activity. Steam billowed, voices rose, and trunks were hauled from the train carriages. Arthur disembarked with quiet efficiency, joining the throng of first-years shepherded toward a cluster of boats waiting at the edge of a dark lake, with the giant figure of Hagrid directing them. The boat ride was breathtaking, even for him. The first glimpse of Hogwarts rising majestically from the cliffs, bathed in the ethereal glow of twilight, was undeniably impressive. Ancient and imposing, the castle radiated an aura of power and mystery that resonated even with his detached sensibilities. The boats carried them through a curtain of ivy into an underground harbor where they disembarked onto a pebbled shore. Hagrid then led them up a stone passageway to emerge in the shadow of the castle, and soon after, up another flight of steps to a massive oak front door. After 3 tremendous knocks from Hagrid's fist, the door swung open to reveal a tall, stern-looking witch in emerald green robes, Professor McGonagall, whose familiar presence confirmed that parts of this world still aligned with the stories Arthur remembered. McGonagall led them across the flagged stone floor of the entrance hall, past a doorway buzzing with excited voices, and into a small, empty chamber. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she said, surveying the assembled first-years with sharp eyes. "The start of term banquet will begin shortly, but before you take your seats in the Great Hall, you will be sorted into your houses." She explained the house system: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, and its importance in shaping Hogwarts life. Arthur listened attentively, though the information wasn't entirely new to him. When McGonagall departed, promising to return when they were ready, whispered speculation about the sorting process erupted among the first years. Arthur felt a curious mix of anticipation and wariness. He had read enough about the 4 houses to understand their stereotypical attributes, yet he wondered which would truly suit him best. When McGonagall returned, she led them in single file into the Great Hall. Arthur had read descriptions of the room, but the reality surpassed his imagination. Thousands of candles floated above 4 long tables where older students watched the new arrivals. The enchanted ceiling mirrored the night sky outside, scattered with stars. At the top, the staff table stretched across the width of the hall, with Albus Dumbledore seated in the center, easily identifiable by his long silver beard and half-moon spectacles. Arthur studied the headmaster carefully, not sure what level of power and influence the old wizard held in this crossover universe. In the books he remembered, Dumbledore had been a complex figure, brilliant and benevolent, yet sometimes manipulative in pursuit of his greater goals. How similar would this version be? McGonagall placed a 4-legged stool before the first years, upon which sat the Sorting Hat, patched, frayed, and ancient. A hush fell over the hall as a tear near the brim opened wide like a mouth, and the hat began to sing. Its song described the 4 houses and their founders, the qualities each valued, and the hat's role in placing students where they would best develop their potential. Arthur listened with academic interest, noting the subtle psychological framing that established house stereotypes while offering just enough flexibility to accommodate exceptions. When the song ended, McGonagall began calling students forward one by one, each taking their turn on the stool with the ancient hat dropped over their eyes. Gryffindor. Hufflepuff. Ravenclaw. The Great Hall erupted in applause for each new addition to their respective houses. Finally, his name was called. Hayes, Arthur. As his name echoed through the hall, Arthur stepped forward with measured confidence, his expression neutral as he took his place on the stool. The hat dropped over his eyes, plunging him momentarily into darkness as it listened to his thoughts. Well, a small voice murmured in his ear. "What have we here? Not a typical first-year mind, certainly. I sense experience, knowledge beyond your years, but I can't quite place why." Interesting. A moment of tension passed as Arthur worried that the hat might access memories of his previous existence. Yet the hat's next words reassured him. No matter. I see intelligence, a thirst for knowledge that would serve you well in Ravenclaw. I also sense courage, of a calculated sort, a willingness to face known risks for proportionate rewards. And then, ambition. Such determination to shape your own destiny, regardless of convention or expectation. Arthur remained silent, knowing that any attempt at deception would be futile with the hat so intimately connected to his thoughts. You've suffered loss, the hat observed more softly. And that loss has shaped you, hardened you in ways both visible and hidden. You seek power not for its own sake, but as a means to security and autonomy. Those are very Slytherin traits. The mention of Slytherin prompted Arthur's first direct communication with the hat. A Muggle born in Slytherin? I don't think that happens often. Rare, but not unheard of, the hat replied. Though such students face challenges. Then perhaps another house would be more practical, Arthur suggested internally. Practical. The hat seemed amused. But that would not be true to who you are. The cunning and ambition I see in you, it would be a disservice to place you elsewhere. Besides, I sense deep down that you relish a challenge. What I really prefer is peace and quiet, Arthur countered in his thoughts. No, the hat contradicted gently, you prefer challenges, obstacles that force growth and development. And being sorted into the House of Salazar will provide that. The current occupants may not welcome you for your birth, but that will only push you to become stronger. But it would isolate me from the entire school, Arthur argued silently. Slytherins won't accept me for my blood status, while the other houses would reject me for my house. Yes, the hat acknowledged, but isn't that isolation what you secretly desire? The solitude to pursue your own path, free from social expectations? We both know where you truly belong, Mr. Hayes. There's really only one place for a mind like yours. Slytherin. The hat announced loudly to the hall. The word reverberated, shattering the expectant silence. A stunned hush fell over the great hall, punctuated by scattered whispers and murmurs of disbelief. Slytherin? Hayes? A Muggle-born? In Slytherin? McGonagall's momentary hesitation before removing the hat spoke volumes. She, too, seemed taken aback by this unusual sorting. Arthur rose from the stool with deliberate calm, straightening his shoulders as he faced the 4 house tables, where hundreds of eyes stared back with shock, curiosity and in some cases, outright hostility. At the Slytherin table, the reaction was palpable. Cold stares turned his way as he walked with carefully composed steps toward his new house. Pure-blood faces, aristocratic and disdainful, registered undisguised disgust. A Muggle-born. Tarnishing their noble house. An affront to their traditions and heritage. Other houses reacted with a mixture of surprise, unease, and wary curiosity. Gryffindors exchanged concerned glances, Hufflepuffs looked bewildered, and Ravenclaws observed with detached intellectual interest. There were no cheers, no welcoming applause, only silence, stares, and a palpable sense of rejection. Arthur slid onto the Slytherin bench with quiet grace, meeting the cold stares with an expression of carefully cultivated indifference. He was in Slytherin, a Muggle born in a house steeped in blood purity and ancient tradition. The irony wasn't lost on him, nor was the challenge it presented. As he sat straight-backed amid the isolation, a strange, steely resolve settled in his chest. If this was to be his path, so be it. He would face whatever came with the same determination that had carried him through the loss of his parents and the upheaval of his carefully constructed plans. As the last student was sorted and the feast began, Arthur turned his attention to his plate, eating with deliberate precision, his face betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. Let them glare. Let them whisper. Their opinions were irrelevant to his greater purpose. He had faced worse than schoolyard prejudice. He had been reborn into a world of magic and marvels of gods and monsters. Hogwarts was merely the first step on a much longer journey, one that would eventually lead him beyond this insular magical society to the wider wonders and dangers of the Marvel Universe. What were a few years of social isolation compared to the power and knowledge he intended to acquire? The Sorting Hat had been right about one thing: Arthur Hayes did enjoy a challenge. And Slytherin House would certainly provide that. Chapter 9, The Muggle-born Slytherin. As Arthur took his seat at the Slytherin table, the silence surrounding him was almost deafening. The other first years subtly shifted away, forming a small island of emptiness around him. Older students glowered at him, their disdain barely veiled behind the civility demanded by the public setting. The start-of-term feast materialized on golden plates before them: roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, potatoes in 5 different preparations, butter-steamed vegetables, and a myriad of dishes that would normally excite a first year. Arthur served himself methodically, the clink of his utensils unnaturally loud in the cocoon of isolation that had formed around him. A first-year boy, with sleek brown hair and features hinting at old money and older blood, finally broke the silence. "Hayes, is it?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "Is it really true that your parents are muggles? Or are you perhaps an orphan who doesn't know your real parents?" The question hung in the air. Conversations nearby stilled as students leaned in to catch his reply, a lifeline, perhaps, an opportunity to add ambiguity to his parentage that might render his presence in Slytherin less offensive. Arthur met the boy's gaze calmly. "No, I'm certain my parents were muggles," he replied, his voice measured and clear. "Both of them." The temperature around him seemed to drop several degrees. A few older students muttered darkly under their breath, and Arthur distinctly heard the word "mudblood" whispered from further down the table. The boy who'd asked recoiled slightly, as though Arthur's simple truth were somehow contagious. "I see," the boy said with a curled lip. "Well, that's unprecedented." Arthur merely nodded and returned to his meal. He had expected this reaction, had even prepared for it, mentally. The reality was unpleasant, but hardly surprising. "The hat's finally gone senile," someone muttered just loud enough for Arthur to hear. "Dumbledore should replace it before it starts putting trolls in Ravenclaw." Laughter rippled across the table, sharp and cruel. Arthur continued eating with deliberate precision, his face betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. Let them glare. Let them whisper. Their opinions meant nothing to him, he had faced far worse than mere schoolyard prejudice. The remainder of the feast passed in isolation. While other tables buzzed with excited chatter, new friendships being forged, older students catching up after summer break, the space around Arthur remained a zone of cold silence. He used the time to observe the high table more carefully, identifying professors from descriptions he'd read or heard from Aurora, Dumbledore at the center, McGonagall beside him, the diminutive Flitwick, Snape with his perpetual scowl, and others whose names he didn't yet know but whose subjects he could guess by their demeanor. Dumbledore's end-of-feast announcements washed over him, warnings about the Forbidden Forest, reminders of banned items, a list apparently curated by Filch, and news of upcoming Quidditch tryouts. Arthur filed away the information methodically while focusing primarily on assessing his housemates and their reactions to him. When the feast finally ended, the prefects rose to lead the first years to their dormitories. "First-year Slytherins, follow me," called a tall, thin boy with a gleaming prefect badge. "Stay together and pay attention. The path to our common room isn't straightforward." The group descended into the dungeons, moving deeper beneath the castle through winding stone corridors. The air grew cooler, and torchlight cast long, flickering shadows on ancient walls. They made several turns, descended multiple staircases, and finally stopped before a stretch of bare, damp stone wall. "This is the entrance to the Slytherin common room," the prefect announced. "The password changes every fortnight. The current password is Serpentis." As he spoke, a concealed stone door slid open, revealing a dark passage beyond. Arthur committed both the location and the password to memory, noting how the other first years bunched together nervously as they followed the prefect. He maintained a calculated distance, not so far as to appear deliberately isolated, but not close enough to invite active rejection. The Slytherin common room was a long, low underground chamber with rough stone walls and a low ceiling. Greenish lamps hung on chains, casting an eerie glow over the space. A fire crackled in an elaborately carved mantelpiece, surrounded by high-backed chairs occupied by older students who regarded the newcomers with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Floor-to-ceiling windows on one wall revealed murky green water. They were partially beneath a lake, Arthur recalled from descriptions he'd read. Standing before the fireplace, waiting for them, was a tall, thin man with sallow skin, a hooked nose, and shoulder-length black hair that fell in greasy curtains. Professor Severus Snape, head of Slytherin House, surveyed the new students with cold, black eyes that seemed to size them up and dismiss them in a single glance. "Welcome to Slytherin," he began, his voice soft yet carrying clearly through the hushed room. "You have been sorted into the House of Ambition, Cunning, and Greatness. Slytherin has produced more ministers of magic than any other house. Our alumni occupy positions of influence throughout magical society." He paced slowly before them, his black robes billowing slightly with each deliberate step. Arthur noticed how the first years straightened instinctively under that penetrating gaze, desperate to impress their imposing head of house. "While you are here, your achievements will earn you house points. Any rule breaking will cost you dearly. At the end of the year, the house with the most points wins the House Cup. Slytherin has claimed this honor for the past 6 years, and I expect you all to contribute to that tradition." Snape's gaze swept over the first years and lingered momentarily on Arthur. Was it Arthur's imagination, or did something flicker in those cold eyes? A brief calculation, perhaps an assessment of potential trouble? "Slytherin House values heritage and tradition," Snape continued, his lip curling slightly. "Though it seems the Sorting Hat occasionally has unusual ideas about where certain students belong." The pointed comment hung in the air, unmistakably aimed at Arthur. Several older students smirked, while others glared more openly at the Muggle-born newcomer. "Regardless," Snape said, his tone suggesting that the subject was closed for now, "all of you are now Slytherins, and outside these walls, you will present a united front. Any disagreements among you are to be resolved privately, within the common room. No Slytherin publicly undermines another Slytherin." Fixing them with a final penetrating stare, he added, "The prefects will show you to your dormitories. My office is down the corridor should any of you need to speak with me, though I sincerely hope that won't be necessary on your first night." With that, Snape swept from the room, his black robes trailing behind him like enormous bat wings. His departure seemed to release a palpable tension, several students visibly relaxed once he was gone. Almost immediately, the female prefect began organizing the first years. "Girls, follow me to your dormitories. Boys, Adrian will show you to yours." The male prefect, Adrian, led the boys through a door and down a stone corridor. "First-year dormitories are here," he announced, stopping before a heavy wooden door. Then, glancing at Arthur, he added, "Though there's been a special arrangement for Hayes." Meaningful looks were exchanged among the other first-year boys as Adrian led them into a spacious chamber with 5 four-poster beds, each draped in green silk hangings, with trunks delivered at the foot of each bed. "Hayes," Adrian called, "your accommodation is this way." He led Arthur further down the corridor to a smaller door. Inside was a modest room containing a single 4-poster bed, a desk, a wardrobe, and a small fireplace. Arthur's trunk was placed at the foot of the bed, and Mercury's cage home to his now slightly disgruntled owl sat on the desk. "No one wanted to share a dormitory with a Muggle-born," Adrian explained with thinly veiled disgust. "Consider yourself lucky to have privacy. Personally, I wouldn't feel comfortable sleeping alone down here. These dungeons have history." The implied threat was unmistakable, but Arthur merely nodded. "Thank you for showing me to my room," he said neutrally. Adrian seemed surprised by his calm response. "Bathrooms down the hall," he added curtly before leaving, the door closing heavily behind him. Finally alone, Arthur surveyed his new quarters with a critical eye. A private room, an unexpected benefit of his pariah status. While the other boys would have to contend with roommates and the lack of privacy, he now had a space entirely his own. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. If this was their idea of punishment, they clearly didn't understand him at all. Methodically, he unpacked his belongings, arranging books and supplies with military precision, hanging his clothing in the wardrobe, and placing textbooks neatly on the desk. A small silver frame containing a cherished photograph of his parents found its place on the bedside table. Then, he spent an hour reviewing defensive spells in his textbooks, a preemptive measure that felt increasingly necessary. Before sleeping, Arthur cast a simple detection charm around his door, a basic spell he'd practiced during the summer that would alert him if anyone approached during the night. It wasn't much protection, but it was better than nothing. With his wand still gripped firmly in his hand beneath his pillow, Arthur Hayes finally settled into his first night at Hogwarts, his mind already plotting the challenges and opportunities that awaited him. Chapter 10, The First Day. Morning arrived without incident. Dungeon rooms remained perpetually dim, their small windows looking out into the murky depths of the lake. Arthur rose early, performed his usual exercises in the limited space available, and prepared for his first day of classes with methodical efficiency. The common room was nearly empty when he entered, with only a few older students reading or completing last-minute assignments. He could feel their eyes tracking him as he crossed toward the exit, but no one addressed him directly. The silent treatment, he could live with that. Having reviewed the castle layout from various books, Arthur was confident he could find his way to the Great Hall without following the other Slytherins. Better to arrive early and avoid any potential confrontations on the first day. His plan might have worked if he hadn't been blocked in a corridor leading to the Great Hall by a group of Slytherin second and third years who were clearly lying in wait. Arthur didn't know all their names yet, but he recognized one, a second year called Marcus Flint, a stocky boy with large, crooked teeth and a permanently mean expression. Well, Flint sneered, planting himself directly in Arthur's path. If it isn't the mudblood who's contaminating our noble house. The others 5 boys and 2 girls, all with expressions of open contempt, spread out to block the corridor completely. It was a classic ambush formation, Arthur noted clinically. They'd chosen a lesser-used corridor with no portraits and far enough from both the dungeons and the Great Hall that intervention was unlikely. "You're a disgrace to Slytherin," continued another boy, tall and weedy with close-set eyes. "A stain on our reputation. You should just quit school and crawl back to the Muggle world where you belong," added one of the girls, her voice dripping with disdain. Arthur assessed the situation with calm detachment. 8 opponents, all older students, and they were blocking the only direct route to the Great Hall from the dungeons. Fighting would be risky, but running would mark him as an easy target for future harassment. Keeping his expression neutral, he said, "I'd like to get to breakfast," attempting to step around them. "Did you hear that?" Flint laughed mockingly. "The mudblood wants breakfast. Too bad he has to go through us first." Arthur noticed the way Flint's hand drifted toward his robe pocket. The others were similarly poised. They were clearly planning to hex him. So much for Snape's instructions about presenting a united front outside the common room. "I have no quarrel with any of you," Arthur said, his voice steady as his hand slipped casually into his pocket, fingers closing around his wand. "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." "Oh, it's already complicated," sneered the tall boy. "Complicated by your dirty blood polluting our house." With that, Flint yanked out his wand and shouted, "Flipendo!" Arthur had anticipated this. In one fluid motion, he drew his own wand and cast, Protego. A shimmering shield materialized before him, causing the knockback jinx to dissipate harmlessly against it. The sudden display of magic, a shield charm typically not taught until 4th year, caused his attackers to hesitate momentarily, surprise evident on their faces. What they didn't know was that Arthur had risen at dawn specifically to practice this spell. He had memorized the theory from his advanced reading and spent hours refining his wand movement and incantation, producing a functional, if somewhat weak, shield. Taking advantage of their momentary surprise, Arthur attempted to move past them again, still hoping to avoid an outright fight. But Flint, recovering quickly, wasn't about to let him escape so easily. "Get him!" Flint snarled, and suddenly spells were flying from multiple directions. Arthur's shield caught the first 2 jinxes, but a third, a stinging hex, grazed his shoulder, sending a sharp pain down his arm. Realizing that pure defense wouldn't suffice, he switched strategies. Years of martial arts training kicked in. As another spell flew toward him, Arthur ducked beneath it and closed the distance to the nearest attacker, sweeping the boy's legs out from under him with a practiced kick. The Slytherin went down hard, his wand skittering across the stone floor. "He's fighting like a filthy muggle!" one of the girls shrieked, her voice filled with outrage and disgust. The corridor erupted into chaos. Spells flew wildly, some missing Arthur entirely and impacting the walls. Arthur weaved between them, using his smaller size and physical training to his advantage, landing precise strikes whenever possible while still defending himself with his wand. A jellylegs jinx made his knees buckle momentarily before he countered it. A furnunculus curse struck his arm, causing painful boils to erupt across his skin. In retaliation, he sent a knockback jinx that sent one attacker sprawling into 2 others. But 8 against 1 were impossible odds, especially when his attackers had more magical education. A vomiting curse hit him square in the chest, and he doubled over, retching violently. Sensing victory, Flint moved in for what was clearly meant to be the final blow. Just then, a voice thundered down the corridor, "Immobulus!" In an instant, everyone froze, caught mid-action by the powerful charm. Professor McGonagall strode toward them, her face white with fury, followed closely by Professor Snape, whose cold eyes took in the scene with calculated precision. "What?" McGonagall demanded, her Scottish accent sharp with anger, "is the meaning of this?" With another flick of her wand, the freezing charm lifted, though none dared to move. Arthur straightened up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand as he tried to regain his composure despite the burning pain and nausea. "He attacked us!" Flint claimed immediately, pointing accusingly at Arthur. "The mud, I mean. Hayes just went mental when we were on our way to breakfast." "Is that so?" McGonagall's eyes narrowed dangerously. "And I suppose Mr. Hayes gave himself those boils and the vomiting curse." "They ambushed me," Arthur stated simply, his voice hoarse. 8 against 1, as I was heading to the Great Hall. Snape's cold gaze swept over the scattered wands and the signs of the scuffle before settling on the Slytherin students, many of whom now avoided his eyes. Though his expression remained unchanged, his posture hinted at suppressed anger. "Hospital wing," McGonagall declared firmly. "All of you. Now. We will sort this out after Madame Pomfrey has seen to your injuries." Thus, Arthur spent his first day at Hogwarts in the hospital wing. Madame Pomfrey moved briskly between beds, mending broken bones, vanishing boils, and administering potions with both skill and stern disapproval. Fighting on the first day, she muttered as she handed Arthur an anti-nausea potion. "Every year it gets worse." Dueling in the corridors before classes have even begun. Later, both McGonagall and Snape arrived to mete out punishment. After interviewing all parties separately, they determined that both sides shared blame, though the exact details of their conclusion remained unclear to Arthur. The Slytherins were faulted for the ambush, and Arthur for escalating the situation into physical violence. 20 points from Slytherin, Snape announced, his voice cold enough to make even the point loss sting. "For disgracing your house with such a public display of poor judgment. And detention," McGonagall added. "For all of you. Mr. Filch will supervise you tomorrow evening in the trophy room." The Slytherins glared daggers at Arthur, clearly blaming him not only for their injuries but for the harsh punishment as well. Arthur met their stares impassively, he had expected nothing less. That evening, when he was finally released from the hospital wing, Arthur returned to his private room in the Slytherin dungeons. He was sore, exhausted, and had missed his first day of classes, but he felt an odd sense of satisfaction. He had stood his ground and shown that he would not be an easy target. Next time, they would think twice before attacking him so brazenly. He spent the rest of the evening reviewing the material he had missed and practicing more defensive spells. It was now clearer than ever, he would need to accelerate his learning of magical combat if he was to survive in Slytherin. The next day, Arthur and the others involved in the fight were up and about again. Broken bones, boils, and nausea had all been mended overnight, the marvel of magical medicine at work. As Arthur attended his first official class, he noticed that other students kept their distance, even those from houses other than Slytherin. Rumors of his fight had spread throughout the school with all the usual embellishments and distortions. Some whispered that he had used dark magic against his fellow Slytherins. Others claimed he had attacked unprovoked like a savage muggle. The first years from the train now avoided his gaze, clearly unwilling to associate with someone already marked as trouble. Arthur did not care. He chose a seat in the corner of the classroom, arranged his materials with methodical precision, and focused entirely on the lesson. If they wanted to isolate him, so be it. He hadn't come to Hogwarts to make friends. He had come to learn magic to gain the power and knowledge that would serve him in the greater world beyond these stone walls. As Professor Flitwick began introducing the principles of charms, Arthur took detailed notes, his quill racing across the parchment. He would master every spell, excel in every subject, and emerge from Hogwarts not as the ostracized Muggle-born Slytherin, but as a wizard of such skill and knowledge that his background would eventually become irrelevant. Let them whisper. Let them stare. In the end, power was the only currency that truly mattered, and Arthur Hayes intended to become very rich indeed. Chapter 11, 6 Years of Solitude Part 1. After the fight with the Slytherins, Arthur's standing at Hogwarts crystallized with remarkable speed. The whispers that followed him through corridors, the empty seats beside him in classrooms, and the subtle shifting away when he entered common spaces all confirmed what was now apparent to everyone at Hogwarts: Arthur Hayes was officially an outcast not just within his own house, but from the student body at large. What might have broken another student became Arthur's strange advantage. With no social distractions, no friendships to maintain, and no trivial conversations to endure, he devoted himself entirely to his studies and to developing his magical abilities. In this peculiar isolation, he found a freedom that others, so entangled in the complex web of adolescent social politics, could never understand. First year. The weeks following the initial corridor ambush set a pattern that would define Arthur's first year. In class, he sat alone, taking meticulous notes and demonstrating magical aptitude that quickly caught the attention of his professors. When he answered questions, his responses were precise and comprehensive, often drawing surprised glances from teachers unaccustomed to such thoroughness from a first year. Outside class, Arthur spent most of his time in the library, methodically working through textbooks that far exceeded the first-year curriculum. Madame Pants, the stern librarian, initially watched him with suspicion, a Slytherin first year requesting books typically reserved for third or fourth years. But as the weeks passed and she observed his careful handling of her precious tomes, her demeanor softened slightly. He never received the warm smiles she occasionally bestowed on her Ravenclaw regulars, but she stopped hovering so noticeably when he requested access to the more advanced shelves. The professors reacted in different ways to Arthur's unusual situation. Flitwick, the diminutive charms professor, treated him with the same cheerful encouragement he offered all students showing aptitude. After Arthur successfully performed a levitation charm on his first attempt with textbook perfect pronunciation and wand movement, Flitwick's delighted squeak and the awarding of 5 Slytherin points marked the first positive recognition of Arthur's abilities. McGonagall maintained strict professionalism in transfiguration, though Arthur occasionally caught her watching him with a puzzled expression during practical exercises. When he transfigured his match into a needle more quickly than any other student, even outpacing some of the older Ravenclaws, a reluctant approval flickered across her usually stern features. Professor Snape presented a more complex dynamic. As head of Slytherin, he was well aware of Arthur's isolation within his own house. During potions lessons, Snape neither singled Arthur out for criticism nor offered him special assistance. However, Arthur noticed that Snape occasionally positioned himself near Arthur's workstation when the more aggressive Slytherins were around, a subtle form of protection that Arthur recognized but never openly acknowledged. Within Slytherin House itself, Arthur's standing evolved from outright rejection to grudging tolerance as his academic performance consistently placed him at the top of their year. His practical magical abilities proved exceptional, even by Slytherin's demanding standards. By the end of his first month, he had earned enough house points through classroom performance to ensure that even the most ambitious Slytherins, those who prized the house cup above blood purity, decided his presence, though not entirely welcome, was not entirely disadvantageous. "He may be a mudblood," Arthur overheard a fifth-year prefect comment in the common room, "but at least he's a useful one." Such backhanded acknowledgement was the closest thing to acceptance Arthur could expect, and he neither sought nor needed more. His academic success served a tactical purpose, making himself valuable enough to be tolerated, but his true focus remained on his long-term goals. Still, the deep-rooted prejudice of certain elements within Slytherin could not be entirely overcome by academic achievement. The more fanatical blood purists, particularly those from older families with Death Eater connections, continued to view Arthur's presence as an intolerable contamination of their house. This led to regular confrontations, though after the first disastrous ambush these became more calculated and less public. Arthur found himself targeted in empty corridors between classes or when returning alone from the library after hours. Each encounter sent both parties to the hospital wing, but as the months passed a curious trend emerged. While Arthur's injuries became less severe, his opponents suffered increasingly serious consequences from these skirmishes. Madame Pomfrey never commented directly, but her increasingly exasperated sighs when treating the same Slytherin aggressors spoke volumes. Adapting to this environment of isolation and intermittent hostility with methodical efficiency, Arthur established a rigorous study schedule that divided his time between required coursework and his own research interests. The Hogwarts Library became his sanctuary, a vast collection offering opportunities to explore magical theory far beyond the first-year curriculum. Then there was also the Room of Requirement, which awed him and provided the means to practice spell casting and quickly enhance his skills. Arthur had even gotten his hands on the Ravenclaw diadem, and having recognized the potential benefits it could offer, he began a side project, finding ways to remove the Horcrux hidden within it without destroying the diadem. The research proved challenging. Hogwarts Library contained scant information on such darkest magic, and even the resources of the Room of Requirement were limited in this area. He would need to search more widely, perhaps in the outside world, to find the knowledge he needed. As the year progressed, Arthur's understanding of magic evolved from mere theoretical knowledge to practical experience. Charms and transfiguration, in particular, seemed to flow through him with an intuitive ease that surprised even him. Even potions, with its precise requirements and subtle nuances, yielded to his methodical approach, earning him grudging approval from Professor Snape. His weekly letters to Aurora were carefully composed factual accounts of his academic progress interspersed with neutral observations about wizarding culture. He deliberately avoided mentioning his social isolation or the subtle discrimination he faced, knowing that such information would only prompt unnecessary concern. The last thing he needed was his MI6 guardian deciding he required counseling to deal with all that isolation. As the months passed, Arthur grew stronger in his magical abilities. The frequency of attacks from Slytherin purists remained stable, but the outcomes became increasingly one-sided. He suffered fewer injuries during these confrontations, while his attackers found themselves needing longer stays in the hospital wing. By the end of his first year, Arthur had established a precarious but sustainable position within Slytherin. His exceptional academic performance and the strength he displayed in his fights ensured that even if people did not like him, they thought twice before crossing him. The end-of-year exams posed no challenge. He completed each one with ease, earning top marks across all subjects. Even potions, where Snape was notorious for harsh grading, yielded an outstanding. Outside of his house, despite occasional requests from year mates for study help, his peers kept their distance due to warnings from their seniors to avoid the Slytherin outcast. This, combined with Arthur's own preference for solitude, ensured that he developed no meaningful friendships during his first year. As he boarded the Hogwarts Express for the return journey to London, Arthur reflected on his first year with clinical detachment. The educational aspect had met his expectations. The social environment, though challenging, was exactly as he wanted it. If it were only the wizarding world he had to consider, Arthur might have felt compelled to cultivate allies and build a network of influence. But his horizons extended far beyond the insular magical community. The true excitement lay across the ocean, in the emerging world of heroes and advanced technology. He would go there eventually, which meant he didn't need to invest heavily in wizarding connections. For now, he was satisfied with the status quo, learning, growing stronger, and preparing for a future that most of his peers couldn't even imagine. Chapter 12, 6 Years of Solitude Part 2. Second Year. Arthur returned to Hogwarts for his second year with a clear strategy and heightened ambitions. Having mastered the foundations of magical education during his first year, he intended to accelerate his studies even further, potentially completing the entire standard curriculum years ahead of schedule. The social landscape remained largely unchanged, but his isolation now carried a different quality. No longer was he merely the anomalous muggle born in Slytherin, he had become Hayes the Hexer, a nickname born from the rumors about the fate of those who dared corner him in deserted corridors. Whispers now centered not only on his blood status but also on his rumored dueling prowess and his mysterious, solitary habits. This year brought new faces to Hogwarts. The arrival of the Weasley twins, in particular, altered the school's atmosphere. Fred and George Weasley quickly established themselves as pranksters extraordinaire, injecting laughter and chaos into an otherwise tense environment. Their antics provided a welcome distraction for the student body and shifted some of the attention away from the Slytherin outcast. Arthur observed these newcomers with detached interest but made no effort to interact with them. The twins, with their Gryffindor boldness and so-called blood traitor status, represented everything that Slytherin purists despised, and associating with them would only intensify the hostility already directed at him. Besides, their boisterous, attention-seeking behavior ran counter to Arthur's preference for operating unnoticed. While Arthur had expected his situation to improve in his second year, it actually deteriorated in unexpected ways. His isolation spread beyond Slytherin House. Soon, it seemed the entire school regarded him with suspicion or outright dislike. Jealous Ravenclaws resented his academic performance, which frequently surpassed their own despite their house's reputation for intelligence, while Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs interpreted his self-contained demeanor as arrogance, taking his indifference to social integration as evidence that he considered himself above them. Before long, Arthur became a target for bullies from all houses, not just Slytherin. It was a surprising development. He hadn't deliberately antagonized anyone outside his own house, but he met this expanded hostility with the same calculated responses he'd employed against the Slytherin purists. The hospital wing became a strange sort of melting pot, housing injured students from all four houses who'd made the mistake of cornering Arthur Hayes. Despite the widespread bullying and frequent skirmishes, the professors seemed oddly reluctant to intervene substantively. They addressed individual incidents with detentions and point deductions but never questioned the systematic harassment or why one student was repeatedly involved in such confrontations. It was as if they dismissed these conflicts as normal school rivalries rather than recognizing the targeted isolation of one student. By mid-year, Arthur had accumulated more detentions than anyone else in his year, even more than the Weasley twins, whose pranks regularly landed them in trouble. Unlike the twins, who wore their punishments like badges of honor, Arthur viewed detentions as inefficient uses of time. Instead, he transformed those hours of mundane labor polishing trophies, scrubbing cauldrons, sorting books into opportunities to mentally review spells and theories. Academically, Arthur continued to excel at a pace that confused and sometimes alarmed his professors. What they didn't know was that through his independent studies he had already completed the entire standard Hogwarts curriculum up to OWL level. In class, he maintained a careful facade, demonstrating just enough exceptional ability to retain his top position without revealing the true depth of his knowledge. The constant conflicts with bullies, while annoying, provided valuable practical applications for his magical studies. Each confrontation became a testing ground for spells he'd previously only practiced in the room of requirement, offering real-world experience that no controlled environment could replicate. Arthur began to view these attacks not as threats but as opportunities, chances to refine his combat magic under genuine pressure. Another significant achievement of his second year was the cleansing of Ravenclaw's diadem. After months of painstaking research, Arthur managed to procure several drops of basilisk venom, an exceptionally rare and tightly controlled substance that significantly depleted his Gringotts vault. The procurement involved navigating a network of discreet apothecaries and questionable dealers, all conducted via carefully anonymized owl correspondence. With the venom in hand, Arthur used the room of requirement to create a controlled environment for the delicate procedure. He applied the venom to the Horcrux with surgical precision, watching in grim fascination as the diadem reacted violently. The soul fragment shrieked, and black smoke billowed forth before dissipating. Although the diadem was damaged in the process, Arthur had prepared for this eventuality. Using materials provided by the room and advanced repair spells he had studied specifically for the purpose, he meticulously restored the artifact to its original condition. The work was painstaking and took weeks of careful magic, but in the end he produced a perfectly functional diadem free from dark magic and ready to serve its original purpose. When Arthur finally placed the restored diadem on his head, the effects exceeded his expectations. His memory sharpened dramatically, his ability to process and retain information multiplied, and his magical focus became almost preternaturally acute. Concepts that had once taken hours to master now took minutes, and spells that had required dozens of attempts came naturally after just a few tries. The diadem accelerated his already impressive learning capacity approximately fivefold, catalyzing an exponential growth in both his magical knowledge and ability. With this powerful aid, Arthur's progress through the Hogwarts curriculum accelerated dramatically. By the end of his second year, he had privately mastered material that most students wouldn't encounter until their 6th or 7th year. Of course, he carefully concealed this advancement, showing in class only what was necessary to maintain his position as a top student without drawing unwanted scrutiny. As the year drew to a close, Arthur reflected with quiet satisfaction on his achievements. Though the year had not been happy in the conventional sense, he remained isolated, frequently targeted, and constantly on guard. He had made exceptional progress toward his long-term goals. The diadem, now safely hidden in a secret location within the room of requirement, would continue to accelerate his magical development. The regular confrontations had honed his combat abilities far beyond what peaceful study could achieve, and his reputation as someone not to be trifled with was solidifying throughout the school, potentially reducing future harassment. When he boarded the Hogwarts Express for the summer holidays, Arthur carried with him not just the standard academic achievements of a successful second year but a wealth of advanced magical knowledge and practical experience that would have impressed even 7th years. The path ahead remained challenging, but he was progressing exactly as planned, perhaps even faster. Third year. Arthur's third year followed a now familiar pattern: intense studying interspersed with sporadic conflicts, though the balance shifted. His academic progress became increasingly advanced, while his skirmishes turned more one-sided. Word spread quickly about the severe consequences faced by those who dared challenge him, and the smarter students soon calculated that the risk was simply not worth it. Only the most stubborn purists and the most foolhardy bullies persisted in their harassment, refusing to believe that a Muggle-born could genuinely outmatch them magically. For Arthur, these occasional skirmishes became almost routine, more of a time-wasting annoyance than a genuine threat. His defensive and offensive capabilities had developed to the point where he could neutralize most attacks with minimal effort, often leaving his opponents stunned, bound, or otherwise incapacitated while he walked away unscathed. The disparity in outcomes became so pronounced that even Madame Pomfrey raised an eyebrow when treating yet another group of injured students, while Arthur required no medical attention at all. Academically, Arthur continued to astonish his professors, though they remained unaware of the true extent of his progress. With the aid of Ravenclaw's diadem, he secretly completed the entire 7-year Hogwarts curriculum by the end of his third year, a fact known only to him. In class, he maintained his carefully cultivated cover, demonstrating exceptional but plausible ability, always careful never to reveal the true depth of his knowledge. Outside the classroom, Arthur expanded his studies even further through independent research. The standard curriculum, even at Newt level, represented only a fraction of the magical knowledge available. Ancient runes, arithmancy, warding techniques, advanced magical theory, obscure charms, and innovative potions methods, he devoured them all with methodical thoroughness. While the Hogwarts library was extensive, it had limitations, particularly when it came to esoteric or controversial magic. The Room of Requirement helped fill some of these gaps, but Arthur was already compiling a list of rare texts he would need to acquire from external sources after graduation. His physical training continued as well, adapted to the constraints of castle life. Early morning runs around the lake, strength exercises in his private room, and regular practice of martial arts maintained his physical conditioning. While magic was clearly the superior force in combat, Arthur had learned that physical agility and non-magical fighting skills provided valuable advantages, especially when facing multiple opponents or in situations where magical shields were impractical. By the end of his third year, Arthur Hayes had established himself as an enigmatic figure at Hogwarts, academically brilliant yet socially isolated, frequently targeted but always emerging victorious from confrontations. Teachers regarded him with a mixture of admiration for his scholastic achievements and concern for his solitary nature. Fellow students viewed him with emotions ranging from envy to fear to grudging respect, but rarely did anyone extend genuine friendship. Arthur himself remained largely indifferent to these perceptions. His focus was steadfastly fixed on his long-term goals: mastering magic, preparing for a life beyond Wizarding Britain, and eventually establishing himself in the emerging landscape of the Marvel Universe with its unique blend of technology, superhuman abilities, and cosmic forces. Hogwarts was merely a stepping stone, wizarding education just one component of the multifaceted power base he intended to build. Chapter 13, 6 Years of Solitude Part 3. Fourth Year. Arthur's fourth year at Hogwarts marked a significant shift in the school's atmosphere. This was the year that Harry Potter, the famed boy who lived, began his magical education. From the moment the small, scrawny 11-year-old with untamable black hair and a lightning-shaped scar stepped into the Great Hall for sorting, the school's collective attention pivoted dramatically. Suddenly, there was someone far more interesting to discuss than the strange, isolated Muggle-born Slytherin who had earned a reputation for fending off bullies with disturbing efficiency. The arrival of Potter and the ensuing whirlwind of gossip provided Arthur with a welcome reduction in unwanted attention. Corridors that once fell silent at his approach now buzzed with excited whispers about Potter's latest exploits: his selection for the Gryffindor Quidditch team, his early run-in with Malfoy, speculations about his scar, and the tragic night his parents died. With the school's focus diverted, Arthur found he could navigate the castle with greater anonymity, allowing him to concentrate more fully on his advanced studies and personal projects. Potter himself was as skinny and malnourished as Arthur had expected. Disillusioned by the wizarding world's canonical narratives, Arthur had long resolved not to interfere with the destiny others seemed to have planned for Potter. Whatever role the boy who lived was destined to play in the coming conflict with Voldemort, Arthur intended to leave it undisturbed. His own path led elsewhere. However, one aspect of the year's events did capture Arthur's attention: the arrival of Professor Quirrell and, more importantly, his hidden passenger. Though Voldemort had been reduced to a parasitic wraith, his lingering presence represented a unique opportunity. Not for confrontation, Arthur had no interest in playing the hero, but for acquisition. The accumulated knowledge within Voldemort's mind, garnered through decades of dark experimentation and magical research, would be invaluable. The challenge lay in accessing it without exposing himself to mortal danger. Throughout the year, Arthur observed Quirrell carefully, noting how the professor's condition deteriorated under the strain of possession and the toll of unicorn blood. Near the end of the term, as events around Potter built toward a climax, Arthur seized his chance. Tracking Quirrell to an isolated corridor late one evening, he stunned the professor with a silent spell from behind. In a calculated burst of magical energy, he incapacitated not only Quirrell but also the malevolent presence within him. With Quirrell unconscious and Voldemort momentarily subdued, Arthur employed the legilimency skills he had diligently honed. Delving deep into the layered minds before him, he bypassed Quirrell's fractured consciousness to access the dark repository that was Voldemort's weakened psyche. For hours, Arthur methodically copied and catalogued information: spell creation techniques, forgotten rituals, obscure magical theories, and countless dark secrets harvested from the memories of victims and loyal followers alike. Voldemort's current state rendered him defenseless against Arthur's practiced intrusion. By the time Arthur withdrew, he had extracted a treasure trove of magical knowledge that, through conventional study, would have taken decades to acquire. He left Quirrell where he lay, confident that neither the professor nor the vestige of Voldemort would recall the encounter in their compromised state. As Arthur had expected, events unfolded largely as the canonical story dictated. Potter and his friends embarked on their perilous adventure beyond the obstacles of the third-floor corridor. Quirrell met his fiery end, Voldemort fled into the shadows, and Dumbledore manipulated the House Cup standings to award Gryffindor a victory that, by all rights, should have gone to Slytherin. Arthur watched the red and gold banners unfurl over the Great Hall with mild amusement. The House Cup meant little to him, but the headmaster's transparent favoritism was an open secret that he found rather intriguing. The true prize of the year, however, resided securely within Arthur's mind: Voldemort's accumulated magical knowledge, a resource far more valuable than any number of house points or even the fraudulent Philosopher's Stone that Potter had supposedly rescued. There was one other acquisition from this tumultuous year that gave Arthur particular satisfaction: a certain invisibility cloak of legendary quality. On Christmas morning, Arthur had managed to infiltrate Gryffindor Tower and borrow the cloak from the pile of gifts reserved for Harry Potter. Up close, the magical artifact was even more remarkable, fluid as water and imbued with an ancient magic that Arthur had never encountered before. He replaced it with one of the finest conventional invisibility cloaks available on the market, purchased months earlier in anticipation of this opportunity. With meticulous precision, he transferred Dumbledore's tracking charms to the replacement, ensuring that even the headmaster wouldn't notice the switch unless he examined it closely. Arthur felt no guilt about this theft. He never claimed to be the good guy, and Potter would still have an excellent invisibility cloak, just not one of the Deathly Hallows. The boy would only realize the difference decades later, when the replacement began to lose its magical properties, as all conventional invisibility cloaks eventually did. 5th year. Arthur's 5th year coincided with the opening of the Chamber of Secrets and the ensuing series of petrifications. The first attack on Mrs. Norris, Filch's cat, triggered a wave of tension throughout the school. Ancient prejudices bubbled to the surface as pure-blood supremacists seized the opportunity to spread fear among Muggle-born students. Remarkably, suspicion briefly fell on Arthur himself. Rumors circulated that he might be the true heir of Slytherin, suggesting that his Muggle-born status was merely a facade concealing a more sinister heritage. For a short, amusing period, students from all houses gave him an even wider berth than usual, treating him with the fearful respect typically reserved for apex predators. This misplaced suspicion evaporated during the infamous dueling club incident, when Harry Potter's ability to speak Parseltongue was dramatically revealed. The school's collective attention immediately shifted to Potter as the more plausible candidate for the heir of Slytherin, leaving Arthur once again to his preferred state of relative anonymity. Throughout the escalating crisis, the petrification of Justin Finch-Fletchley, Colin Creevey, and others, Arthur maintained his steady routine of advanced study. The castle-wide atmosphere of fear and suspicion did little to unsettle him. He observed the unfolding events with clinical detachment, recognizing the canonical pattern and anticipating each development. The mass hysteria, the persecution of Potter, Hagrid's subsequent removal, all unfolded as expected. Arthur had long decided that the wizarding world's internal conflicts were not his responsibility to resolve. This policy of non-intervention was abruptly challenged when the heir of Slytherin, or more accurately, Ginny Weasley, possessed by Tom Riddle's diary, apparently targeted Arthur as the basilisk's next victim. Late one evening, as Arthur returned from the library, a soft, sinister hissing emerged from the pipes in the wall beside him, followed by the scraping sound of something massive moving within the castle's ancient plumbing. Recognizing the immediate danger, Arthur did not hesitate. He swiftly retrieved his invisibility cloak from his bag and draped it over himself, closing his eyes as he pressed against the wall. Soon, the enormous serpent emerged from a hidden opening, its scales rasping against the stone as it slithered into the corridor. Through his barely opened eyelids, Arthur could make out a blur of vibrant green, just enough to confirm the creature's presence without meeting its lethal gaze. Behind the basilisk, a slight figure with red hair moved with the unnerving stillness of possession. Rather than attempt a confrontation with the basilisk, a battle that would raise far too many questions about his capabilities, Arthur remained perfectly still beneath the cloak until both predator and possessed puppet had passed. Once the danger subsided, he carefully removed the cloak and aimed a particularly nasty curse at the diary peeking from Ginny Weasley's pocket. The spell, extracted from Voldemort's memories and designed to inflict excruciating pain even upon disembodied spirits and magical constructs, hit its mark. Ginny collapsed instantly as the diary emitted a high, thin scream that no ordinary book should be capable of. The basilisk, momentarily confused by its master's incapacitation, retreated into the pipes with angry hisses. Arthur slipped away before anyone could recover, satisfied that the punishment had been duly administered. The curse achieved had an extra effect. The attacks ceased for several weeks while the diary Horcrux recovered from the magical assault. This pause gave the school a brief respite from terror, although rumors about the chamber and its monster continued to swirl. When the attacks eventually resumed, Arthur was not targeted again. Perhaps the Horcrux had deemed him too dangerous, or perhaps it simply had other priorities. Arthur allowed the canonical events to play out from there: Potter's discovery of the chamber's entrance, his confrontation with the basilisk, and the subsequent destruction of the diary. When the petrified students were revived and Hagrid returned from Azkaban, the school celebrated the end of another crisis, blissfully unaware that the war was merely postponed, not prevented. Another noteworthy development that year was Arthur's acquisition of basilisk parts following Potter's confrontation with the creature. Using creative, unconventional methods involving a snake, he managed to access the Chamber of Secrets several days after the final battle. The massive serpent still lay where it had fallen, its lethal eyes destroyed, yet its other valuable components intact. Over several nights, Arthur painstakingly harvested the most useful parts: venom glands, scales, fangs, and heart tissue, each of which was a priceless ingredient in advanced potions or a rare magical material for crafting. He carefully preserved these treasures in a magically expanded and warded trunk, ready for transport. The profits from discreetly selling selected basilisk components would have made him one of the wealthiest young wizards in Britain, yet he retained the most valuable parts for his own use, recognizing their potential in advanced potions and magical crafting. Chapter 14, 6 Years of Solitude Part 4. 6th Year. When Arthur's OWL results arrived that summer, the envelope contained exactly what he had expected: 13 outstanding grades across every subject he had taken. The ministry examiner's note mentioned his exceptional practical demonstrations and unprecedented theoretical understanding, a faint sort of praise for someone who had already mastered the entire Newt curriculum in private. His 6th year at Hogwarts began with an unwelcome development. Dementors were stationed around the school perimeter, supposedly to protect students from the escaped convict Sirius Black. Arthur found the ministry's logic baffling. These creatures had failed to contain Black at Azkaban, where they were supposed to be at their best. How could they possibly be more effective at a school with hundreds of entry points and secret passages? Wizarding logic at its finest, Arthur muttered to himself as he watched the dark, hooded figures drifting at the edge of the forbidden forest from his dormitory window. Their presence created a perpetual chill that seeped through the castle's ancient stones, affecting even the normally cozy Great Hall. For most students, the Dementors represented a constant, lurking dread. Even teachers visibly stiffened when forced to pass near them during outdoor lessons. Arthur, however, viewed them as little more than an inconvenience. He had already mastered the Patronus charm, a notoriously difficult piece of magic that many adult wizards never achieve. His Patronus took the form of a peregrine falcon, a brilliant silver bird that could easily drive back several Dementors at once. The first time he casually conjured it while crossing the grounds, Professor Flitwick, who happened to be nearby, nearly fell over in astonishment. "My word, Hayes!" The tiny charm's professor had squeaked, his voice a mixture of delight and disbelief. "That's extraordinarily advanced magic. Most adult wizards can't produce a corporeal Patronus." Arthur had merely shrugged, unwilling to explain that he'd mastered the charm years ago. The falcon form mirrored his animagus, a transformation he had achieved after months of disciplined practice and research during his 4th year. While he appreciated the falcon's speed and keen vision, he'd been mildly disappointed that his transformation wasn't something more exotic. The theoretical texts on animagi insisted that only natural animals were possible, but Arthur had secretly hoped that his unusual magical potential might allow for something grander. Still, the falcon served its purpose well enough, granting him unnoticed aerial observation when needed. The rest of the school year unfolded predictably, with Arthur watching the canonical events play out from a careful distance. The Golden Trio's investigation of Black, their discovery of Pettigrew masquerading as Weasley's pet rat, the confrontation in the Shrieking Shack, Lupin's transformation that allowed Pettigrew to escape, all proceeded without his interference. Even Black's near execution by Dementors and last-minute rescue, obviously orchestrated by time manipulation, followed the expected pattern. Arthur found the use of a time turner particularly interesting, if not downright reckless. These devices were supposed to be among the most restricted magical items in Britain, yet one had been casually issued to a 13-year-old girl simply so she could attend extra classes. There was no precedent in any historical record for such irresponsible deployment of temporal magic. "Another of Dumbledore's questionable decisions," he remarked to Mercury one evening, stroking the owl's feathers as he reviewed his notes on temporal theory. "Giving a device that can literally fracture reality to an overachieving teenager to manage her class schedule." Knowing enough about the Marvel Universe's temporal catastrophes, Arthur maintained a healthy respect for chronological integrity and deliberately avoided any experiments in that direction, recognizing that even small alterations could cascade into universe-threatening paradoxes. Better to let Potter and his friends risk those complications while he focused on his own development. The most significant personal milestone of the year came on Arthur's 17th birthday in May, marking his coming of age in the wizarding world. Now legally an adult under wizarding law, he could use magic outside Hogwarts without triggering the Trace, the ministry's system for detecting underage magic. This newfound freedom dramatically expanded his opportunities for practice and experimentation during the summer months. When the school year ended and Arthur returned to London, the first thing he did was host a small, private going-away gathering for Aurora Thatcher. Over the years, their relationship had evolved from strict professional guardianship to something resembling a strained sibling bond. Though she remained connected to MI6's supernatural division, her direct supervision had gradually relaxed as Arthur demonstrated his capability for independent living. In the drawing room of his family's manor, which he had reclaimed as his permanent residence now that he was legally an adult in the wizarding world, Aurora asked, "So this is it? You're officially cutting ties with MI6 oversight?" "Not cutting ties," Arthur corrected, taking a sip from his glass. "I'm simply transitioning to a more appropriate arrangement now that I'm of age." Aurora studied him with that penetrating gaze that had once intimidated him, now tempered by a hint of amusement. "You know you're still a minor in the Muggle world, right? 17 isn't adulthood by non-magical standards." "A technicality," Arthur replied dismissively. "I am an adult in the world that matters to my abilities." Aurora sighed, recognizing the familiar stubbornness in his expression. "You always were impossible to manage. I suppose I should be grateful you bothered with this farewell at all." A rare softness touched Arthur's usually impassive features. "Despite our differences, I do appreciate what you've done these past years. You've been fair. That's more than most would have managed." Raising her glass in a toast, Aurora said, "To your future endeavors, then. Try not to upend the natural order of things too dramatically, will you?" "No promises," Arthur replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as they clinked glasses. Returning to the present, Arthur looked ahead to his final year at Hogwarts with growing anticipation. Everything was right on track, even ahead of his initial schedule in some ways. His magical education far exceeded that of most adult wizards, and his finances were solid thanks to both his inheritance and the windfall from basilisk parts. The restrictive oversight of his childhood was now behind him like a shed skin. Soon, he thought with quiet excitement, he'd finally be free to pursue his real ambitions to immerse himself in the Marvel world, where he could carve out his own path among gods, heroes, and villains. Chapter 15, The Final Year. The Hogwarts carriages trundled up the winding path toward the castle, their skeletal thestral drivers visible only to those who had witnessed death. Arthur Hayes sat alone in the last carriage, watching as the ancient school emerged from the twilight mist. The familiar silhouette of towers and turrets against the darkening sky stirred no nostalgia in him, merely a clinical acknowledgement that this would be the last time he made this particular journey. 7 years. It seemed both remarkably brief and inexplicably long. He had learned and grown considerably within the walls of this ancient castle, though not in the ways its founders might have intended. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance, Arthur descended and gathered his thoughts. He hoped this year would mirror the previous ones, productive and relatively quiet. He had no desire to become entangled in any of the events surrounding the boy who lived in his inevitable drama. As he walked through the castle gates, he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Younger students, excitedly discussing their holidays, immediately fell silent and moved aside when they spotted him. The crowd parted before Arthur like water, no one daring to block his path. This pleasant state of affairs lasted until he neared the Great Hall, where a cluster of Slytherins had positioned themselves in his way. They were led by Alexander Roll, a 7th year whose family's Death Eater connections were an open secret among Slytherin's elite circles. They stood waiting for him like caricatures of first-chapter villains, all swagger and no substance. "Well, look who it is," Roll drawled, his aristocratic features arranging themselves into a practiced sneer as he positioned himself directly in Arthur's path. "Hayes, contaminating Hogwarts for one final year." The others arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, not directly threatening, but clearly attempting intimidation. Arthur sighed with undisguised annoyance. 7 years wasn't enough to convince you I belong exactly where I choose to be? "Though I do think you people were sorted into the wrong house," he replied, his tone more bored than confrontational. "I had hoped repetition might eventually lead to comprehension, even in your limited intellectual capacity. This behavior would suit Gryffindor House perfectly." Roll's face darkened with anger, his hand twitching toward his wand pocket. "You dare compare us with those blood traitors? You've been allowed to play at being a wizard for too long, Mudblood. This year, things will be different. It will be our time again soon." Arthur understood the source of their renewed confidence. The antics of a few Death Eaters at the Quidditch World Cup had reignited their pure-blood fervor. Arthur had skipped the event entirely, having no interest in Quidditch, though in retrospect, he might have enjoyed testing himself against those silver-masked fools. Now these students, likely children of those cloaked troublemakers, had found the courage to confront him again. Arthur cared little, he would be leaving Britain within a year, and Voldemort's impending return was Dumbledore's and Potter's problem, not his. Threatening me has historically proven unwise, Arthur observed mildly, making a show of checking his watch. But some lessons need frequent repetition, it seems. You arrogant Cassius Warrington, a sixth-year Slytherin, stepped forward with his wand half-drawn, apparently having had enough of Arthur's dismissive attitude. The transformation happened so quickly that several onlookers who had paused to watch the confrontation missed it entirely. One moment Warrington stood there, wand half-raised, teeth bared in a sneer, the next, a small, green frog sat blinking confusedly on the stone path where the Slytherin had been standing. No incantation had been spoken. Arthur hadn't even reached for his wand, which remained in his pocket. Just a brief flicker of concentration crossed his features, a subtle gesture of his fingers at his side, and Warrington was amphibious. A stunned silence fell over the assembled students. Human-to-animal transfiguration surpassed Newt-level magic under any circumstances. To perform it silently was impressive even for accomplished wizards. To do so wandlessly, with such apparent ease, was something few professors at Hogwarts could manage. None of the onlookers had ever witnessed anything like it. Roll's eyes widened in shock, his own wand frozen halfway out of his pocket. The casual display of power that so vastly exceeded his own clearly rattled him more than he wanted to admit. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice higher than normal. "Change him back immediately." "He'll revert in approximately 30 minutes, Arthur replied calmly, stepping past the now scattered group. "Unless, of course, someone attempts a counter-transfiguration improperly, in which case the results might be interesting." One of the younger Slytherins quickly scooped up the frantically croaking frog, and the entire group backed away, giving Arthur a wide berth as he ascended the steps to the entrance hall. Behind him, he could hear Roll's urgent whisper, "Get him to Snape, now!" followed by the sound of hurried footsteps retreating toward the dungeons. Arthur allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction as he resumed his way toward the Great Hall. He had enjoyed the fear on the blood purists' faces at his display of power. He hoped they might finally learn their lesson, though experience suggested they would eventually return, their arrogance overriding their self-preservation instincts. The Great Hall buzzed with activity. Students filed in, chattering excitedly as they found seats at their house tables. Arthur moved to his usual isolated position at the far end of the Slytherin table, the empty spaces around him as familiar as they were convenient. From his vantage point, he surveyed the staff table with calculated interest. Most of the familiar faces were present: McGonagall engaged in conversation with tiny Professor Flitwick, Hagrid taking up more than his share of space at one end, Snape looking as sour as ever. The notable addition was the scarred, weather-beaten face of who appeared to be Alastor Mad-Eye Moody, the new defense against the dark arts teacher. Arthur studied the impostor with clinical detachment. The magical eye that gave the real Moody his nickname swiveled constantly, scanning the hall with unnatural vigilance. The man's posture was too rigid, his movements too controlled for someone supposedly as paranoid and unpredictable as the legendary Auror. Barty Crouch Jr., Arthur thought, watching the Death Eater play his role with admirable commitment. He was doing a reasonably convincing job with his disguise. Voldemort had likely provided him with a crash course on how to behave and perhaps some memories of the old Auror to avoid detection. The fact that Dumbledore either hadn't noticed or more likely was allowing the charade to proceed was interesting. The headmaster's tendency to use people as chess pieces in his long game against Voldemort was something Arthur had recognized both from his knowledge of the books and from his observations over the past 6 years at Hogwarts. Too many coincidences, too many questionable decisions suggested either that Dumbledore and the other professors were incompetent or that they were deliberately allowing events to unfold. This year would be no exception, with Potter being maneuvered toward the inevitable confrontation in the graveyard that would mark Voldemort's return. None of it was Arthur's concern. The machinations of a self-styled Dark Lord and a manipulative headmaster were problems for magical Britain to solve, not diversions from his own carefully crafted plans. The sorting ceremony proceeded with its usual tedium: nervous first years, the ancient hats declarations, applause from respective house tables. Arthur paid minimal attention, his mind already planning his future beyond Britain's shores. The Marvel world contained numerous fascinating events, and Arthur could hardly wait to witness or participate in them. His contemplation was interrupted by Dumbledore rising to his feet after the last first year had been sorted. The headmaster's silver beard gleamed in the candlelight as he spread his arms in welcome. "To our newcomers," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall, "welcome. To our old hands, welcome back. There is a time for speech-making, but this is not it. Tuck in." Food materialized on the golden plates, provoking appreciative gasps from the first years and immediate activity from everyone else. Arthur served himself with methodical efficiency. Around him, conversations bubbled with the usual beginning of term topics: summer activities, class schedules, speculation about the new defense teacher. As the main courses faded and were replaced by desserts, Arthur noticed an undercurrent of unusual excitement running through the student body. Fragments of conversation reached him: whispered references to some special event, knowing looks exchanged between older students, vague allusions to what's happening this year. Evidently, information had leaked about the Triwizard Tournament, though Arthur doubted it had ever truly been a secret in the wizarding world. The Slytherins, at least, should have known from the very beginning. When the desserts finally disappeared and Dumbledore rose again, the hall fell into an expectant hush with remarkable speed. "Now that we are all fed and watered," the headmaster began, "I must once more ask for your attention while I give out a few notices. Mr. Filch, the caretaker, has asked me to tell you that the list of objects forbidden inside the castle has this year been extended to include screaming yo-yos, fanged frisbees, and ever-bashing boomerangs." Arthur tuned out the standard announcements, focusing again on his own thoughts until Dumbledore's tone shifted. "It is also my painful duty to inform you that the Inter-House Quidditch Cup will not take place this year." This provoked immediate reactions from the Quidditch enthusiasts, particularly the Weasley twins at the Gryffindor table, who appeared too shocked to speak. "This is due," Dumbledore continued, raising his voice slightly, "to an event that will be starting in October, and continuing throughout the school year, taking up much of the teachers' time and energy, but I am sure you will all enjoy it immensely. I have great pleasure in announcing that the Triwizard Tournament will be taking place at Hogwarts this year." "You're joking!" exclaimed one of the Weasley twins. As Dumbledore explained the history and nature of the tournament, Arthur found his interest waning rapidly. He had no interest in the tournament, its promise of eternal glory, or the measly 1,000 galleons. The prize seemed pitiful compensation for the risks involved. "Eager though I know all of you will be to bring the Triwizard Cup to Hogwarts," Dumbledore was saying, "the heads of the participating schools, along with the Ministry of Magic, have agreed to impose an age restriction on contenders this year. Only students who are of age, that is to say, 17 years or older, will be permitted to put forward their names for consideration." This announcement provoked loud protests from younger students, particularly the Weasley twins, who would miss the age cut-off by mere months. "The delegations from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang will be arriving in October," Dumbledore continued over the disgruntled muttering, "and I know you will all extend every courtesy to our foreign guests while they are with us. And now, it is late, and I know how important it is to you all to be alert and rested as you enter your lessons tomorrow morning." As the students rose in a cacophony of scraping benches and excited chatter, Arthur remained seated, waiting for the initial rush to subside. He had no intention of interfering with the canonical timeline. Why should he? The eventual outcome, Voldemort's defeat after several years of warfare, was a problem for magical Britain to solve, not him. By the time the real conflict ignited, he would be far away and perhaps forgotten by everyone here. With this decision firmly in mind, Arthur rose and made his way toward the Slytherin dormitories, moving against the flow of excited students speculating about the tournament. Let them have their games and their wars. His destiny lay elsewhere, in a world of genuine power and possibility that none of them could even imagine. Chapter 16, Foreign Arrivals. October arrived with a sudden shift in the weather, brisk winds carrying the scent of frost, trees surrounding the castle grounds surrendering their leaves in cascades of red and gold. Classes had settled into their familiar routine, though an undercurrent of anticipation ran through the student body as the arrival date for the Beauxbatons and Durmstrang delegations approached. Arthur viewed the mounting excitement with detached amusement. His fellow seventh years could barely focus on their new coursework, constantly speculating about the foreign students, the tournament tasks, and who might become the Hogwarts champion. Even the professors seemed affected, inspecting classrooms with unusual scrutiny and drilling students on proper decorum when addressing international guests. "Remember," Professor McGonagall had emphasized during Transfiguration, "you will be representing not only Hogwarts but Wizarding Britain as a whole. I expect exemplary behavior from all of you." Her stern gaze had swept the classroom before lingering briefly on Arthur, who met it with polite indifference. He had no intention of embarrassing the school that would draw unwanted attention, but neither did he particularly care about impressing foreign wizards. The day before the delegations were scheduled to arrive, Filch and a team of house elves undertook a manic cleaning campaign. Portraits were scrubbed, much to their vocal displeasure, suits of armor polished to gleaming, and every stone surface scoured until the entire castle seemed to shine with an unnatural cleanliness. Even the dungeons, perpetually damp and musty, smelled vaguely of lemon polish. "Bit excessive, isn't it?" remarked a Slytherin fourth year to no one in particular as Filch aggressively dusted a gargoyle outside the Great Hall. "It's not like the Queen's coming to visit." The caretaker had rounded on the student with such ferocity that the boy fled, Filch's tirade about international magical cooperation and standards echoing down the corridor after him. Arthur maintained his own routine of advanced study and physical training. He had grown stronger compared to the wizards he knew, but he was well aware of what else was out there: sorcerers, aliens, and gods. Compared to them, he was still weak. He knew he needed to get stronger. On the morning of October 30th, Arthur woke before dawn as usual, completed his stretching exercises, and headed to the room for an hour of intensive magical practice before breakfast. The corridors were deserted at this hour, which suited him perfectly. The peaceful solitude of early morning was something he had come to value during his years at Hogwarts. When he finally emerged and made his way to the Great Hall, he found it transformed with overnight decorations. Enormous silk banners representing each Hogwarts house hung from the walls, along with the unfamiliar crests of Beauxbatons and Durmstrang. The usual candles floating overhead were supplemented with enchanted lanterns that shifted color gradually, casting the hall in slowly changing hues. "The delegations will be arriving at precisely 6 o'clock, Professor Dumbledore announced at breakfast. "Lessons will end half an hour early today." A wave of excited murmuring interrupted him, quickly silenced by a raised hand. "And all students are to return their bags and books to their dormitories before assembling in front of the castle to greet our guests." Throughout the day, an almost palpable tension built within the castle. Even Arthur found himself mildly curious about the foreign schools and their different magical approaches. The canon rarely mentioned them, leaving much to the imagination. At 5:30, the heads of houses began organizing their students into neat rows in front of the castle. The evening air carried a sharp chill that had first years shivering in their cloaks while the older students cast subtle warming charms on themselves. "How exactly do you suppose they're getting here?" Arthur overheard a Hufflepuff asking. "Apparitions impossible on Hogwarts grounds. International portkayat, maybe," suggested another. "Too many people for that to be practical," a Ravenclaw interjected authoritatively. "The Ministry restrictions on mass portkeys are quite strict since the Quidditch World Cup incident." Arthur positioned himself at the end of the Slytherin ranks, furthest from Snape's watchful eye. The house heads were patrolling their lines, straightening ties, and confiscating inappropriate items from the Weasley twins, who protested unconvincingly that the fanged frisbee was just a welcome gift. "Aha!" came Dumbledore's voice from the back row. "Unless I am very much mistaken, the delegation from Beauxbatons approaches." A sixth-year Slytherin pointed toward the sky. There! Something large was hurtling across the deepening blue sky toward the castle, growing increasingly distinct as it approached. "It's a dragon!" shrieked a first year. "Don't be stupid," replied an older student. "It's a flying house." Neither was correct. As the object descended toward the Hogwarts grounds, it revealed itself to be an enormous powder blue carriage, the size of a small house, pulled through the air by a dozen winged horses, each the size of an elephant. The spectacular arrival drew gasps and exclamations from the assembled students. The carriage landed with considerable force, bouncing on its vast wheels before coming to a stop. The horses tossed their enormous heads, their fiery red eyes surveying the crowd with what appeared to be disdain. A boy in pale blue robes jumped down from the carriage and unfolded a set of golden steps. Then, a shining black shoe emerged, followed by the tallest woman Arthur had ever seen, easily matching Hagrid's impressive height. Dumbledore began to clap, and the students followed his lead, applauding as the giantess descended the golden stairs. "My dear Madame Maxime," Dumbledore greeted her, barely having to bend to kiss her extended hand. "Welcome to Hogwarts." "Dumbledore," she replied in a deep, accented voice. "I hope I find you well." "In excellent form, thank you," Dumbledore assured her. "My pupils," Madame Maxime said, waving a bejeweled hand behind her. About a dozen boys and girls, all appearing to be in their late teens, had emerged from the carriage. They stood shivering in silk robes, looking up at Hogwarts with apprehensive expressions. Their light clothing was clearly ill-suited to the Scottish autumn. "Has Karkaroff arrived yet?" Madame Maxime inquired. "He should be here any moment," Dumbledore replied. "Would you prefer to wait here and greet him, or would you like to step inside and warm up a trifle?" "Warm up, I think," Madame Maxime decided. "But ze orzes. Our care of magical creatures teacher will be delighted to take care of them," Dumbledore assured her, gesturing toward Hagrid, who had arrived to manage the enormous palominos. As the Beaux Batons students followed their headmistress into the castle, whispers broke out among the Hogwarts ranks. The foreign students moved with graceful precision, suggesting formal training in deportment that wasn't part of the Hogwarts curriculum. Several of the boys appeared to have military-style bearing, while the girls carried themselves with almost aristocratic poise. The whispers died away suddenly as a strange rumbling sound carried across the grounds. From the lake previously smooth as black glass rose a disturbance. A whirlpool formed in the center, from which emerged what appeared to be a ship's mast, followed by the rest of the vessel, a skeletal craft with an eerie resemblance to a resurrected wreck. Dim, misty lights glowed from its portholes, casting ghostly illumination on the water's surface. The ship glided smoothly to the bank, and a plank was lowered onto the shore. Silhouettes disembarked, all appearing bulky and substantial, an effect created by the thick furs they wore as cloaks over their blood-red robes. The man leading them had silver hair and a matching goatee, cut in a sharp style that accentuated his cruel mouth and cold eyes. "Dumbledore!" he called heartily. "How are you, my dear fellow?" "Blooming, thank you, Professor Karkaroff," Dumbledore replied. Arthur noticed how differently the Durmstrang students carried themselves compared to the Beaux Batons delegation. While the French students seemed delicate and refined, these newcomers projected strength and endurance. They moved with military precision, their posture perfect, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with tactical awareness. One student in particular drew attention, a thick-eyebrowed young man whom excited whispers identified as Victor Krum, the Bulgarian national Quidditch team's star seeker. His slouching gait contrasted with his classmates' rigid posture, yet there was unmistakable power in his movement. As they entered the great hall for the welcoming feast, the visiting students hesitated, surveying the room before deciding where to sit. Madame Maxime directed her pupils toward the Ravenclaw table, where they arranged themselves with careful precision, still shivering slightly and viewing the castle with expressions ranging from disdain to reluctant admiration. The Durmstrang students, after a moment's consideration from Karkaroff, headed toward the Slytherin table. Arthur's usual isolation at the far end of the table remained undisturbed, the empty seats surrounding him formed a stark contrast to the crowded benches elsewhere. The Durmstrang students settled at the opposite end, clustering around Malfoy and his cronies, who appeared delighted by Krum's proximity. Curious glances occasionally directed toward Arthur did not go unnoticed. A particularly direct stare from a broad-shouldered Durmstrang boy prompted Malfoy to lean over and whisper something in his ear, gesturing subtly in Arthur's direction. Whatever was said caused the boy's eyebrows to rise momentarily before his expression shifted to a contemptuous sneer. Arthur met his gaze with cool indifference before returning his attention to the high table, where the staff had been augmented by several unfamiliar faces, ministry officials, here to oversee the tournament. Ludo Bagman's boyish excitement contrasted sharply with Bartolomew's Crouch's stern demeanor as they took seats alongside Dumbledore. The feast itself was more elaborate than usual, featuring dishes apparently selected to showcase British wizarding cuisine while incorporating specialties from the visitors' homelands. French bouillabaisse and Eastern European goulash appeared alongside traditional Hogwarts fare, creating an unusually diverse spread. Throughout the meal, the visiting students continued their surreptitious examination of Arthur, their curiosity clearly piqued by whatever they'd been told. Occasionally, a Hogwarts student would lean toward one of the visitors, whispering explanations that inevitably resulted in reactions ranging from skeptical disbelief to wary fascination. Muggle-born Slytherin. Wandless transfiguration. Never loses a fight. Fragments of conversation drifted to Arthur's ears, painting the familiar portrait of half-truths and exaggerations that constituted his reputation. When the golden plates had been cleared, Dumbledore rose to formally introduce the tournament. An impartial selector will decide which students are most worthy to compete for the Triwizard Cup, the glory of their school, and 1,000 galleons personal prize money. The mention of the prize caused a ripple of excited murmurs. The selector, Dumbledore continued, is the Goblet of Fire. With theatrical timing, the headmaster tapped a casket with his wand. The lid creaked open, and Dumbledore extracted a roughly hewn wooden cup, unremarkable except for the dancing blue-white flames that filled it to the brim. Anybody wishing to submit themselves as champion must write their name and school clearly upon a slip of parchment and drop it into the goblet, Dumbledore explained. Tomorrow night, Halloween, the goblet will return the names of the 3 it has judged most worthy to represent their schools. When the feast finally concluded, Arthur rose with the rest of the students. As he navigated the crowded hall, he noted how the Durmstrang and Beaux Batons students watched him, their expressions now having solidified into distinct categories: fascination, fear, or disdain, sometimes all 3 intermingled on a single face. One particularly large Durmstrang student made a point of bumping into him, muttering something in what sounded like Bulgarian before rejoining his classmates. The aggressive gesture was so blatantly deliberate that even nearby Hogwarts students tensed, anticipating Arthur's reaction. They were disappointed. Arthur merely stepped aside and continued walking, not bothering to acknowledge the provocation. Such petty challenges were beneath his notice. Back in his private room in the Slytherin dungeons, Arthur planned for the coming day. With classes suspended to accommodate the tournament preparations, he would have additional time for his morning training routine. The grounds would be relatively empty around dawn, providing an ideal opportunity for outdoor exercise before most students were awake. What Arthur couldn't anticipate was that this routine would present others with an opportunity they had been eagerly awaiting. Chapter 17, An Eventful Morning. Dawn broke over Hogwarts with a thin, milky light that did little to dispel the morning chill. Arthur's breath formed small clouds as he jogged along the edge of the lake, his pace steady and controlled. The grounds were silent except for the occasional call of birds and the rhythmic sound of Arthur's footfalls on the frost-hardened earth. Most students were still asleep, particularly after the late night of the welcoming feast. Even Hagrid's chimney remained smokeless, suggesting the gamekeeper hadn't yet risen to tend his unusual menagerie. This solitude was precisely why Arthur valued these early hours. No stares, no whispers, no carefully maintained distance from the pariah of Slytherin. Just the physical discipline of running, the burn of muscles working, and the clarity of mind that came with exertion. He was approaching a more remote section of the grounds, where the manicured lawns gave way to wilder growth near the edge of the forbidden forest, when he sensed a change in the atmosphere. The hair on the back of his neck rose slightly, an instinctive reaction to magical surveillance that he had developed over years of being targeted. Without breaking stride, Arthur extended his magical awareness outward, feeling for the telltale signatures of concealment charms and disillusionment spells. They were there, clustered in the shadows of trees and behind boulders, multiple presences attempting to remain hidden while they watched him approach. An ambush, then. Not particularly surprising given the previous day's events. New audiences often inspired his long-standing adversaries to renewed efforts, especially with foreign students to impress. Arthur continued running for another 50 meters before stopping abruptly in a small clearing ringed by ancient oak trees. He performed a few deliberate stretching motions, as if cooling down from his exercise, while actually positioning himself optimally within the space. "If you're planning to watch me all morning," he called out to the apparently empty clearing, "you might as well make yourselves comfortable. Otherwise, I suggest you stop wasting my time and show yourselves." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, gradually, figures began emerging from various hiding places around the clearing. Some dispelled disillusionment charms, others simply stepped out from behind trees or rocks. They arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, wands already in hand, expressions ranging from nervous determination to open hostility. It was an impressive assembly, far larger than any previous confrontation Arthur had faced. Roll and several other Slytherin purists formed the center of the group, flanked by a contingent of Ravenclaws whom Arthur recognized as the more aggressively members of that house. More surprising were the Durmstrang students, 5 of their bulliest males, including the one who had deliberately bumped into him the previous night. Even Beauxbatons was represented by 2 tall boys with identical contemptuous expressions. 20 in all. Apparently, his reputation had inspired a truly collaborative international effort. "Quite the gathering," Arthur remarked, his tone conversational. "I'm almost flattered." Roll stepped forward, his wand pointed directly at Arthur's chest. "You've been allowed to contaminate Hogwarts with your filthy blood for too long, Hayes. Now you've embarrassed us in front of our guests." "An international incident, clearly," Arthur replied dryly. "Is this what they call magical cooperation these days?" One of the Durmstrang students spat on the ground. "We heard about you. Muggleborn who thinks he is better than proper wizards. This is not right. Someone needs to teach you your proper place," added a Ravenclaw, Martin Belby, if Arthur recalled correctly. "You may have fooled the professors with your tricks, but we know what you really are." "And what might that be?" Arthur asked, making a show of checking his watch as if the conversation was keeping him from more important matters. "A fraud," Roll snarled. "A mudblood who doesn't belong in our world, let alone in Slytherin." "You've had this explained to you repeatedly," Arthur sighed. "Yet comprehension continues to elude you. Perhaps visualization might help." He made no move for his wand, which remained in his pocket. Instead, he simply stood, seemingly relaxed despite being surrounded by 20 hostile wizards. The casual confidence in his posture visibly unnerved several of his would-be attackers. 20 against 1, Arthur observed mildly. And you still don't seem confident. Should I close my eyes to make it more sporting? That provocation was enough. Roll's face contorted with rage, and he slashed his wand downward with a snarled incantation. Several others followed immediately, various colored jets of light streaking toward Arthur from different directions. But Arthur was no longer standing in their path. With a sudden surge of magic that seemed to emanate from his very core, the atmosphere around him shimmered. Objects from the surrounding environment, fallen branches, stones, even clumps of earth rose into the air and began orbiting his body at increasing speed. As the spells converged on his position, the orbiting materials intercepted them, the magical energy dissipating harmlessly against the improvised shields. It was a visual echo of the accidental magic Arthur had unleashed years ago, the night his parents died, but now controlled, refined, and amplified to an astonishing degree. The assembled attackers faltered, many taking involuntary steps backward as they witnessed wandless magic on a scale that defied conventional understanding of what should be possible for a wizard Arthur's age, or indeed, for wizards of any age. The levitated objects continued their protective orbit, but now they began to transform. Branches twisted and flattened into perfect discs, stones restructured into smooth panels, earth compressed into dense shields. All of these transfigured objects maintained their circular path around Arthur, creating a dynamic, multi-layered defense system that moved with fluid precision. All of this occurred without Arthur drawing his wand or uttering a single incantation. His only visible action was a subtle gesture of his fingers, as if conducting an invisible orchestra. "Impressive, isn't it?" Arthur remarked, his voice carrying easily despite the magical display surrounding him. "Now, shall we continue this educational demonstration, or would you prefer to reconsider?" For a moment, it seemed the assembled group might indeed reconsider. Several of the Ravenclaws exchanged uncertain glances, while two of the Beauxbatons students began whispering urgently to each other in French. Then one of the Durmstrang students, the largest of them, with a shaved head and a prominent scar across his jawline, stepped forward aggressively. "Enough tricks!" he bellowed. "Incendio Maxima!" A massive jet of flame erupted from his wand, far more powerful than the standard fire-making spell taught at Hogwarts. It engulfed Arthur's position entirely, momentarily obscuring him from view. When the flames cleared, Arthur stood untouched. The rotating shields had seamlessly merged into a complete dome that had absorbed the full force of the attack. The dome now separated back into its component parts, resuming their orbit as if nothing had happened. "Not bad," Arthur acknowledged. "But rather predictable." Now the entire group attacked simultaneously, a barrage of spells flying toward Arthur from all directions. Stunning spells, binding hexes, blasting curses, a chaotic mixture of offensive magic that should have overwhelmed any conventional defense. Arthur's shields intercepted everything, the transfigured objects dancing through the air with impossible precision, always exactly where they needed to be to block incoming attacks. Throughout this onslaught, his expression remained calm, almost bored, giving the unsettling impression that he was expending minimal effort. The attackers grew increasingly desperate, each failed attempt only heightening their frustration. They began casting more dangerous spells, cutting curses, bone breakers, even what appeared to be borderline dark magic from some of the Durmstrang students. Nothing penetrated Arthur's defenses. After allowing this to continue for several minutes, primarily to assess whether any of them possessed magical techniques he hadn't previously encountered, Arthur decided he'd indulged their efforts long enough. It was time to conclude this confrontation in a way that would send a clear message. "I believe you've had sufficient opportunity to demonstrate your abilities," he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos of spell fire. "Allow me to respond in kind." Instead of retaliating with magic, however, Arthur did something that momentarily confused his attackers. He stepped forward, allowing his shields to continue their protective orbit while he began moving toward the assembled group. It took them a moment to realize his intention, and by then, it was too late. Arthur moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years honing his physical reflexes alongside his magical abilities. He ducked beneath a hastily cast hex, stepped inside the guard of a Ravenclaw, and delivered a precise strike to the boy's solar plexus. The student crumpled immediately, wand falling from nerveless fingers as he struggled to breathe. Before the others could react, Arthur was already moving to his next target, a Durmstrang student whose bulky frame couldn't compensate for his slow reactions. A quick sweep of the legs sent him crashing to the ground, followed by a calculated blow to the temple that left him dazed but conscious. The sight of Arthur engaging in physical combat, fighting like a muggle, seemed to both confuse and outrage his opponents. "Wizards, particularly purebloods, were notorious for their disdain of non-magical fighting techniques, viewing them as beneath their dignity. Arthur's choice to fight this way was deliberate, a calculated move to undermine and humiliate them. He moved through their ranks with methodical efficiency, his shields continuing to intercept magical attacks while he engaged them physically. A precise strike to the throat here, a joint lock there, a sweeping kick followed by a controlled throw, all executed with the practiced skill of someone who had studied multiple martial disciplines. The Beaux Batons students fell back, clearly unnerved by this unorthodox approach. One attempted to create distance for spell casting, only to find himself grabbed by the wrist, his momentum used against him as Arthur flipped him onto his back with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. Roll, seeing his allies falling one by one, abandoned any pretense of wizarding dignity and charged Arthur directly, attempting to use his superior size as a weapon. It was a mistake. Arthur sidestepped smoothly, caught the Slytherin's extended arm, and applied precise pressure to nerve points that sent shocks of pain up to his shoulder. Roll howled, dropping to his knees as Arthur released him with a dismissive push. Within minutes, the entire group lay scattered across the clearing, bruised, dazed, some clutching injured limbs, others simply trying to recover their breath. None had suffered any truly serious injuries. Arthur had deliberately controlled his strikes to cause pain and temporary incapacitation without lasting damage. The message would be clearer if they were all mobile enough to be seen at breakfast, their visible injuries testament to their failed ambush. Arthur stood in the center of the clearing, surveying the results of his handiwork with clinical detachment. His breathing remained steady, his appearance almost entirely unruffled except for a light sheen of sweat that could easily have come from his morning run. Consider this a practical lesson in several subjects, he addressed the groaning figures around him. Magical defense, certainly. Tactical assessment. And perhaps most importantly, his gaze swept over them with cool indifference, the folly of underestimating an opponent based on preconceived notions. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. I would suggest visiting Madame Pomfrey, but I suspect you'd rather avoid explaining how you acquired these injuries. Cold compresses should help with the swelling. The discoloration, unfortunately, will need to fade naturally, a visible reminder for the next few days. As he walked away, resuming his jogging pace as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a brief interruption to his morning exercise, Arthur allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Tonight would be the Halloween feast and the selection of champions. The bruised faces and stiff movements of his would-be attackers would be clearly visible to the entire student body, a powerful statement without a single word needed. Let them explain to their peers how 20 wizards armed with wands had been physically overcome by a single Muggle-born. Let them try to reconcile their beliefs about blood superiority with the undeniable evidence of their own failure. Some lessons, Arthur reflected, were best taught through practical demonstration rather than theory. Chapter 18, The Goblet's Choice. The Great Hall buzzed with excitement as students filed in for the Halloween feast. The decorations were more elaborate than usual. Live bats flew near the enchanted ceiling, huge carved pumpkins glowed with eerie flames inside them, and ghostly cobwebs hung from the high beams, appearing and vanishing randomly. The goblet of fire stood prominently before the high table, its blue flames casting strange shadows across the room. As Arthur made his way to his usual isolated spot at the Slytherin table, he noticed an immediate difference in the atmosphere. The typical wide berth students gave him had expanded significantly, and the whispers that followed his passage were more numerous and urgent than usual. Glancing around the hall, he noted several students from various houses sporting bruises, black eyes, and other visible injuries that they were making poor attempts to conceal. The morning's fight hadn't stayed secret, as expected. 20 students suddenly showing up with injuries tended to draw attention, especially when none of them would give a straight answer about what happened. The rumor mill had been working overtime, collecting bits of the truth from reluctant admissions and overheard conversations. Did you hear? 20 of them, and he didn't even use his wand. Just walked away without a scratch. Floating shields all around him. Knocked Roll out with one punch, I heard. The whispers stopped abruptly whenever Arthur looked in their direction. Even the usually brave Gryffindors kept their distance, their courage apparently having limits when faced with the growing legend of Arthur Hayes. At the Slytherin table, Roll and his friends were noticeably quiet. Roll himself had a spectacular black eye that had resisted magical healing attempts, while Warrington's stiff movements suggested bruised ribs under his robes. They avoided eye contact with Arthur, staring intently at their plates whenever he looked their way. The visiting students seemed particularly fascinated by this development. Durmstrang's bulky representative from the morning ambush sat slumped at the far end of the table, his face clearly showing evidence of Arthur's handiwork. His classmates alternated between muttering to each other and stealing evaluating glances at Arthur, their expressions a mix of grudging respect and lingering hostility. Arthur helped himself to the feast with practiced indifference. He'd expected consequences from the morning's events, but so far, no professor had approached him about the incident. Either they didn't know, unlikely, given Hogwarts' terrible record for keeping secrets, or they had chosen to ignore it. The latter possibility suggested either a remarkable level of common sense or, more likely, an unwillingness to navigate the complex politics of punishing a student who had been outnumbered 20-1. "Your attention, please." Dumbledore's voice cut through the excited chatter as the feast concluded. The candles dimmed throughout the hall, leaving the goblet's blue-white flames as the main source of light. "The moment has arrived. The goblet is almost ready to make its decision." The entire hall fell silent, faces turned expectantly toward the ancient artifact. Dumbledore made a sweeping gesture with his wand, extinguishing the remaining candles and plunging the hall into near darkness illuminated only by the goblet's otherworldly glow. "Any second now," Dumbledore murmured, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Suddenly, the flames turned red, sparks flying in all directions. A tongue of flame shot into the air, ejecting a charred piece of parchment that Dumbledore caught skillfully in his hand. The flames returned to their blue-white state as the headmaster read by their light. "The champion for Durmstrang," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "will be Victor Krum." A storm of applause erupted, particularly enthusiastic from the Slytherin table where the Durmstrang students were seated. Krum rose from his place, his hunched posture and surly expression unchanged by his selection. He shambled toward Dumbledore, shook his hand, and proceeded through a door at the right side of the hall. "Bravo, Victor!" boomed Karkaroff, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Knew you had it in you." The applause died down, and attention returned to the goblet. Once again, the flames turned red, and a second piece of parchment shot out. "The champion for Beau's Batons," said Dumbledore, "is Fleur Delacour." A girl with silvery blonde hair and an ethereal grace rose from the Ravenclaw table. She moved toward the front of the hall with dance-like precision, seeming to glide rather than walk as her classmates reacted with a mixture of applause and poorly concealed disappointment. Two girls were actually sobbing into their arms. After Fleur disappeared into the side chamber, silence fell once more. The tension was obvious as students leaned forward, many Hogwarts students crossing fingers under the tables or muttering quiet spells for luck. The goblet's flames turned red a third time, and Dumbledore caught the parchment that shot forth. "The Hogwarts champion," he called out, "is Arthur Hayes." The announcement was met with absolute silence, a vacuum of sound so complete it seemed to press physically on the eardrums. Arthur remained perfectly still, his face betraying only the slightest widening of his eyes as evidence of his surprise. Around him, expressions ranged from shock to horror to grudging acknowledgement. At the far end of the Slytherin table, several students exchanged furtive glances, their faces showing a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Dumbledore's voice cut through the silence again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Hayes. Up here, if you please." Arthur did not move from his seat. His mind worked rapidly, analyzing the situation. He had not entered his name, of that he was certain. Someone else had done so, and judging by the guilty looks being exchanged down the table, the culprits were not difficult to identify. But their motives made little sense. The Triwizard Tournament was dangerous, yes, but it also brought significant prestige. Why would blood purists nominate a Muggle-born as Hogwarts champion? Then understanding dawned. They hadn't been thinking clearly. Their hatred had overwhelmed their reason, leading them to focus solely on the danger while overlooking the honor. They had viewed the tournament as a potential death trap rather than an opportunity for glory. "Mr. Hayes," Dumbledore called again, his tone now tinged with impatience, "please come forward." Arthur finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Headmaster, I'm afraid you are mistaken. I never entered my name in the cup, so I am not the champion." A low murmur swept through the hall at this direct contradiction. At the high table, McGonagall leaned toward Dumbledore, whispering urgently in his ear. "Be that as it may, Mr. Hayes," Dumbledore replied, "your name has emerged from the Goblet of Fire. This constitutes a binding magical contract. Please proceed to the Champion's Chamber so we may discuss this further." "I entered no contract," Arthur stated flatly, remaining seated. "And I have no interest in participating in your tournament." The murmurs grew louder. At the high table, Barty Crouch Sr. had risen to his feet, his face a mask of outrage at this defiance of tradition. Karkaroff and Madame Maxime were engaged in heated whispers with each other, while Ludo Bagman looked utterly bewildered by this unexpected development. Before Dumbledore could respond further, there was a disturbance at the goblet. The flames had turned red again, sparks flying more violently than before. Another tongue of flame shot high into the air, and with it, another piece of parchment. Automatically, Dumbledore reached out and seized the parchment. He held it out and stared at the name written upon it. A long silence followed, during which Dumbledore continued to stare at the slip in his hand while everyone in the room stared at Dumbledore. Then the headmaster cleared his throat and read out, "Harry Potter." The ensuing silence was, if possible, even more absolute than the one that had followed Arthur's name. Every head in the Great Hall swiveled toward the Gryffindor table, where Potter sat frozen, his face a picture of shock and confusion. "I didn't put my name in," Harry said blankly. "You know I didn't." At the high table, McGonagall had risen to her feet, swept past Ludo Bagman and Professor Karkaroff to whisper urgently in Dumbledore's ear. "Harry Potter!" Dumbledore called again. "Harry! Up here, if you please." Unlike Arthur, Potter responded to the summons. Looking dazed and uncertain, he got to his feet, stumbled slightly, and moved toward the high table. The whispers that followed him were harsh, accusatory, filled with jealousy and suspicion. "He cheated. Not even 17 yet. Always has to be the center of attention." As Potter disappeared into the champion's chamber, attention swung back to Arthur, who remained impassively seated at the Slytherin table. The room seemed to be holding its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Mr. Hayes," Dumbledore said, his voice now holding a distinct edge, "I must insist that you join the other champions immediately." Arthur met the headmaster's gaze directly, his own expression coolly evaluative. The tension in the hall stretched like an over-tightened wire as wizard and student engaged in a silent battle of wills before the entire school. Chapter 19, When a Slytherin Bargains. The tense silence that had fallen over the Great Hall was finally broken by Arthur himself. "Headmaster," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "what is the exact name written on the note? Can you please show it to me?" Dumbledore hesitated for a brief moment before responding. "It says A. Hayes. Here, you may examine it yourself." Arthur rose from his seat and approached the high table, aware of hundreds of pairs of eyes following his every movement. Taking the charred parchment from Dumbledore, he examined it carefully. The paper was clearly torn from one of his assignments. He recognized his own handwriting and the specific quality of parchment he used. The name A. Hayes was written in the upper corner where he usually placed his shortened signature on non-official documents. Arthur knew from his introduction to the wizarding world that full names were considered important in magic, so he had always been careful to never use his full name in unnecessary places, precisely to avoid situations like this. "As you can see, Professor," Arthur said, loud enough for at least the front rows to hear, "it says A. Hayes and not Arthur Hayes. The contract, if one exists, would be binding to A. Hayes, not necessarily me. Perhaps you should search for someone else with those initials in Britain." Dumbledore's usually twinkling eyes hardened. "I am not in the mood for games, Mr. Hayes. You are the only student with that surname at Hogwarts, and you must participate." "I'm not playing games either, Headmaster," Arthur replied evenly. "You can see that I did not enter myself. This piece of paper has been torn from an exam or assignment and placed in the cup without my knowledge or consent. Therefore, I am not the one selected by the goblet." The Great Hall remained silent, students and staff alike watching the exchange with complete attention. Ludo Bagman looked increasingly uncomfortable, while Crouch maintained his stern expression. "Why are you so resistant to being chosen, Mr. Hayes?" Dumbledore asked, his voice carrying a hint of frustration. "Most students here would be thrilled to be the Hogwarts champion. Not me. I prefer my quiet life." "Regardless," Dumbledore said firmly, "you will have to participate." He turned to the ministry official. "Isn't that right, Barty?" "Yes," Crouch answered stiffly. "The rules are clear." Arthur shook his head. "I don't believe so. I know enough about magical contracts to understand they work on intent, not merely names. If it were that simple, the system would be easy to abuse. Anyone could create an artifact like the goblet, establish a contract, take signed parchments from their enemies, and enter them without their knowledge. Those people would lose their magic without ever knowing why." An uneasy murmur spread through the hall. Several students exchanged worried glances, and even some of the professors looked troubled by Arthur's reasoning. This is not just any artifact, Mr. Hayes, Dumbledore countered. This is the Goblet of Fire. Even I don't fully understand all aspects of its magic. I stand by my interpretation, Arthur said calmly. You can continue the tournament without me. We already have 3 champions, 1 from each school. Potter can be the Hogwarts champion. It remains a Triwizard tournament. Crouch stepped forward, his thin face tight with strain. You will be risking your magic, Mr. Hayes. I will be risking nothing, Arthur replied. Though the person who entered my name might risk their magic if they fail to participate. The effect of these words was immediate. A 7th-year Slytherin near Roll suddenly jumped to his feet, his face drained of color. What? I'll risk my magic! He exclaimed in panic. Roll! You didn't tell me this before you told me to put Hayes's name in the cup. The hall erupted in whispers as the truth became clear, though most of the professors had already guessed what had happened. Congratulations, Mr. Bull, Arthur said dryly. You're the Hogwarts champion. Though I'm not entirely certain. Snape, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. What do you mean, Mr. Hayes? Well, I'm not sure how the cup selects the true champion, Arthur explained. Is it the person who physically placed the name? Or is it the person who obtained the parchment, or possibly the one who conceived the idea of entering my name? The magical binding is ambiguous. More students began to look alarmed as the implications sank in. Several Slytherins were now exchanging panicked glances, and even some Durmstrang students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Or it might indeed be you, Mr. Hayes, Crouch said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. Though you do raise valid points about the unclear nature of the binding. Dumbledore. The headmaster stroked his beard thoughtfully. I cannot verify precisely whom the contract binds. However, if Mr. Hayes were to accept his selection as champion, all this uncertainty would be resolved. And why would I do that? Arthur asked, allowing a hint of coldness to enter his voice. There's a certain satisfaction in watching my fellow housemates wait anxiously to discover which of them might lose their magic. Dumbledore's expression grew stern. I'm sure you don't truly mean that, Mr. Hayes. You must learn to forgive. They are your schoolmates, regardless of past differences. I mean every word, Arthur replied coolly. Headmaster, the other champions are waiting. There's no need to waste time with me. My position won't change with moral kidnapping like this. I'm sure you already know I don't care about what people think of me. The staff and ministry officials exchanged troubled glances, clearly at a loss. Even threats of expulsion held no weight. Arthur simply pointed out that as a legal adult in the wizarding world, expulsion would merely speed up his departure from a school he was leaving in a few months anyway. The situation grew more complicated as it became apparent that students from all 3 schools had been involved in the plot. Karkaroff and Madame Maxime exchanged concerned whispers, clearly worried about potential magical consequences for their own students from influential families. Someone suggested cancelling the tournament and selecting champions again, but Crouch firmly declared this impossible. Whether this was true or merely Crouch Jr.'s influence through the Imperious Curse, Arthur neither knew nor cared. After several minutes of hushed consultation among the staff, Dumbledore turned back to Arthur with a resigned expression. Mr. Hayes, what would it take for you to participate in the tournament? A subtle shift crossed Arthur's face, the barest hint of satisfaction. Are you trying to bribe me, headmaster? If so, you're finally taking the right approach. I can indeed be bribed. Throughout his years at Hogwarts, despite facing constant prejudice, Arthur had managed to build an impressive foundation of magical knowledge. He had devoured every book in the Hogwarts library, purchased every worthwhile text from Flourish and Blots, and mastered spells that many adult wizards struggled with. Yet he knew this was merely scratching the surface of what magic truly offered. The real treasures of magical knowledge remained locked away from him: ancient family grimoires passed down through generations, rare enchanted texts hidden in private collections, and the closely guarded secrets of magical masters who only taught their craft to those with the right bloodlines or connections. The magical elite had created an invisible wall around their most powerful knowledge, and despite his many clever attempts, Arthur had never managed to breach it. He was powerful for his age, yes, but nowhere near what he could become with access to those forbidden teachings. Even the Room of Requirement, which had been his greatest ally at Hogwarts, couldn't conjure knowledge that existed only in jealously protected tomes and memories. The room's magic, for all its wonder, couldn't create what it had never encountered. I enjoy learning, Professor, Arthur continued, his tone businesslike. If you can provide books that satisfy my academic interests, I would reconsider my position regarding this tournament. What followed was a remarkable negotiation conducted before the entire school. Students watched in fascination as Arthur Hayes, a Muggle-born Slytherin, negotiated terms with three of the most powerful magical figures in Europe. After considerable back and forth, an agreement was reached. Arthur would be granted, on loan for a year, 3 rare magical books, one from each headmaster. From Dumbledore, he received a comprehensive volume on alchemy, from Madame Maxime, an advanced text on magical enchantment, and from Karkaroff, a rare treatise on Eastern European curse theory. "I'll need this agreement in writing," Arthur stated firmly. "A magically binding contract, to ensure all parties honor their commitments." Dumbledore's eyes had lost their customary twinkle, but he nodded in agreement. With a flick of his wand, he conjured a piece of parchment and a quill, quickly drafting the terms they had discussed. As the 3 headmasters and Arthur signed the document, a subtle golden glow enveloped the parchment, signifying the magical binding of their agreement. Only then did Arthur turn toward the champion's chamber, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Shall we proceed, headmaster? I believe we've kept the other champions waiting long enough." Dumbledore gestured toward the door, his expression unreadable. The ministry officials followed, looking considerably less pleased with the outcome than Arthur. As they walked, whispers erupted throughout the great hall, students frantically discussing what they had just witnessed. For many, it was the first time they had seen authority figures like Dumbledore forced to negotiate rather than simply give orders. It was a valuable lesson in power dynamics that no textbook could have taught them, a demonstration that even in the hierarchical wizarding world, power could shift unexpectedly to those who knew how to use it. And Arthur Hayes, it seemed, knew exactly how to use it. Chapter 20, The 4 Champions. Arthur walked toward the small chamber off the Great Hall, keeping a careful distance between himself and the clearly unhappy headmaster. The magical contract he'd negotiated was tucked safely in his pocket, the parchment still faintly warm from the binding magic that had sealed their agreement. As annoyed as the professors might be, they would have to honor their commitment, 3 rare magical books in exchange for his participation in a tournament he had no interest in winning. The chamber itself was smaller than he'd expected, with a crackling fire and several comfortable armchairs where the other champions waited. Victor Crumb stood with his back to the wall, his heavy eyebrows drawn together in what seemed to be his permanent scowl. The Beauxbatons champion, Fleur Delacour, had positioned herself near the fireplace, her silvery hair reflecting the dancing flames. Both kept a respectful distance from Harry Potter, who sat hunched in a corner chair looking completely miserable. The 2 other champions, Crumb and Delacour, had assumed Harry to be the Hogwarts champion, his youth and obvious distress making them think he was simply overwhelmed by the unexpected selection. They had wisely chosen to leave him alone, respecting his need for space and quiet. Fleur glanced up as Arthur entered, a flicker of surprise crossing her delicate features. "They are calling us back?" she asked, her voice carrying a French accent. "The selection is complete, non?" Before Arthur could reply, Ludo Bagman bustled into the room, his face flushed with excitement, his round figure barely contained within his brightly colored robes. "Extraordinary!" he exclaimed, beaming at the assembled group. "Absolutely extraordinary! We have 4 champions competing in the tournament." Fleur Delacour tossed her hair, a dismissive smile playing across her perfect features. "Oh, very funny joke, Mr. Bagman." "Joke?" Bagman repeated, bewildered. No, not at all. Mr. Hayes is the Hogwarts champion and Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire as the 4th champion." Crumb stepped forward, his voice a low rumble. "Hogwarts has 2 champions? This is not fair." Bagman, unaware of their discontent, continued to babble about how unprecedented the situation was, the excitement it would generate, and the added challenge it presented. Arthur, however, remained silent, watching the unfolding chaos with detached amusement. He was, after all, the only one in the room who was genuinely pleased with the evening's outcome. As Fleur and Crumb were arguing with Bagman, the door behind them opened again, and a large group entered, Professor Dumbledore, followed by Mr. Crouch, Professor Karkaroff, Madame Maxime, Professor McGonagall and Professor Snape. They had started at the same time, but then the heads had stopped to give further instructions to the school and let them disperse. "Madame Maxime," Fleur said at once, striding over to her headmistress. "Ze are saying that this little boy is to compete also. And that Hogwarts will have 2 champions." Madame Maxime had drawn herself up to her full, considerable height. The top of her handsome head brushed the candle-filled chandelier as she glared down at Dumbledore. I forgot about all this with the trouble with Mr. Hayes. How do we proceed with this unfairness, Dumbledore? She said imperiously. I'd rather like to know that myself, Dumbledore, said Karkaroff, his steely smile fixed, his eyes colder than ever. 2 Hogwarts champions? I don't remember anyone telling me the host school is allowed 2 champions, or have I not read the rules carefully enough? He gave a short, nasty laugh that didn't reach his eyes. It's no one's fault but Potter's, Karkaroff, said Snape softly, his black eyes filled with dislike. Don't go blaming Dumbledore for Potter's determination to break rules. He has been crossing lines since he arrived here. Thank you, Severus, said Dumbledore firmly, silencing further comments from the potions master. He turned to Harry. Did you put your name into the Goblet of Fire, Harry? No, Harry said firmly, though Arthur noticed the anxiety in the boy's eyes. Did you ask an older student to put it into the Goblet of Fire for you? Dumbledore continued, ignoring Madame Maxime's impatient but of course he is lying. No, said Harry strongly. Throughout this exchange, Arthur remained silent, observing the political dynamics at play. The foreign headmasters were naturally protecting their school's interests, Snape was indulging his bias against Potter, and Dumbledore was trying to maintain control of an increasingly tense situation. As the adults continued arguing, tensions high from everything that had happened tonight, Arthur finally spoke up. He did not like the poor boy being ganged up on like this. Headmaster, Potter didn't enter himself, he said, his calm voice cutting through the heated debate. Everyone turned to look at him, some apparently having forgotten he was even there. From my example, it's obvious the age line wasn't foolproof. Any adult could enter anyone's name like Mr. Bull entered mine. Karkaroff sneered. And why should we believe? In Potter's case, Arthur continued, ignoring the interruption, it's even more telling. He was selected as a 4th champion. Someone clearly tampered with the goblet to recognize 4 schools instead of 3. Otherwise, Potter wouldn't have had a chance to be selected at all, since I was already among the contestants from Hogwarts. A moment of silence followed this logical assessment. Moody, who had entered during the commotion, gave Arthur an appraising look that didn't match the Auror's usual behavior. Makes sense, Moody growled. Powerful Confondu's charm to bamboozle that goblet into forgetting that only 3 schools compete. I'd guess Potter's name was submitted under a 4th school, to ensure he faced no competition. Fleur looked between Arthur and the professors, clearly confused. But you said he was the Hogwarts champion, she said, pointing at Arthur. Did he not enter himself either? No, I didn't, Arthur confirmed. Madame Maxime sighed dramatically. Mr. Hayes' caused quite the scene in the Great Hall. He refused to participate, claiming his name was entered without his knowledge. He even forced these gentlemen and us, she gestured toward Dumbledore and the ministry officials, to provide compensation in exchange for his participation. The other champions stared at Arthur with new interest. Even Krum, whose expression rarely changed, raised his eyebrows slightly. You refused the Triwizard Tournament? Fleur asked, incredulous. She had tried so hard and prayed to get selected, and here was someone who didn't even want to be the champion. Arthur shrugged. It offered little that interested me. Harry, who had been watching this exchange with growing hope, suddenly straightened in his chair. Can I do that too? He asked urgently. Can I refuse to participate? If someone else entered me, they'd be the one to lose their magic, right? Arthur glanced at the boy, feeling a bit of sympathy despite himself. Unfortunately, you should have protested immediately in the Great Hall, as I did, he explained. By entering this chamber, you've implicitly accepted your role as champion. What? Harry's face fell. But no one told me that. Arthur gestured toward Dumbledore. Ask the headmaster. I'm not responsible for informing you of magical protocols. Harry turned to Dumbledore, his expression betrayed, but the headmaster merely sighed heavily. I'm afraid Mr. Hayes is correct, Harry. The magic of the goblet now binds you to compete. After several more minutes of pointless argument, Barty Crouch stepped forward, his face gaunt in the firelight. We must follow the rules, and the rules state clearly that those people whose names come out of the Goblet of Fire are bound to compete in the tournament. Well, Barty knows the rule book back to front, said Bagman, beaming as though this settled the matter. Crouch turned to address the 4 champions directly. The first task is designed to test your daring, so we are not going to be telling you what it is. Courage in the face of the unknown is an important quality in a wizard, very important. The first task will take place on November the 24th, in front of the other students and the panel of judges. The champions are not permitted to ask for or accept help of any kind from their teachers to complete the tasks in the tournament. The champions will face the first challenge armed only with their wands. They will receive information about the second task when the first is over. Owing to the demanding and time-consuming nature of the tournament, the champions are exempted from end-of-year tests. After the briefing, Arthur approached Dumbledore. "The books I was promised," he said, his voice firm. "When may I collect them?" Dumbledore's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "You may collect the volume on alchemy from my office tomorrow morning, Mr. Hayes. Professor Karkaroff and Madame Maxime will provide their contributions to me by then as well." "Excellent," Arthur replied, entirely unconcerned by the clear disapproval in the headmaster's tone. The meeting ended shortly after, with the foreign delegations leaving in obvious displeasure. As Arthur made his way back toward the Slytherin dungeons, he thought about what he'd gained from the evening's events. The alchemy text from Dumbledore would be particularly valuable. The headmaster was famous for his work with Nicholas Flamel. Similarly, Beauxbaton's tradition of excellence in enchantment meant Madame Maxime's contribution would likely contain techniques unavailable in Britain. The dark arts volume from Karkaroff held less appeal. Thanks to his extraction of Voldemort's memories years ago, Arthur already possessed considerable theoretical knowledge of curses, rituals, and other forbidden magics. He understood their theory and countermeasures but had little interest in actually using them. Most required disgusting components or would corrupt the caster's mind unless extensive precautions were taken, hardly worth the trouble when other magical approaches could achieve similar results without such drawbacks. The Slytherin common room fell silent when Arthur entered. Students who had been excitedly discussing the evening's events suddenly found their textbooks fascinating or became absorbed in staring at the ceiling. Arthur noticed several groups of upper-year students huddled in corners, their expressions ranging from worried to outright angry. It wasn't hard to figure out the situation. The smarter Slytherins had clearly realized what their housemates had accidentally done. Rather than humiliating or endangering Arthur Hayes, they had instead handed him both glory and access to rare magical knowledge. The culprits were receiving a thorough verbal lashing from their peers for this spectacular miscalculation. Arthur allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as he walked through the common room. The irony was perfect. Their attempt to harm him had backfired completely. Without acknowledging anyone, he proceeded directly to his private room and closed the door. As he prepared for bed, Arthur's thoughts drifted not to the tournament challenges ahead, but to the ancient knowledge that would soon be his. Sometimes, it seemed, even pure-blood scheming had its unexpected benefits.
Thanks for listening.